Coming up on the show today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel.
The President has deployed, as you know, the world's largest aircraft carrier group to the region to make very clear our intent to deter anyone contemplating any further aggression against Israel.
Plus, Kenya's plan to send a peacekeeping force to Haiti hits a snag.
The whole thing is very unprocedural. It is unconstitutional.
And later, the families of Hamas's hostages. And in Australia, a referendum to recognize First Nations people in the Constitution. What effect will it have on inequality? Today is Thursday, October 12th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. We're on the ground amidst the devastation in Israel in a moment. First, though, Secretary of State Blinken is in Israel. He's there to send a strong message of solidarity and support as the country responds to cross-border attacks by Hamas, the bloodiest in Israel's 75-year history. Blinken is expected to meet with senior Israeli officials to inquire what else Israel needs as it seeks to free hostages held by Hamas, regain control of its border with Gaza, and to destroy Hamas's operational capacity. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has the story.
Residents of Kibbutz Masada in northern Israel took refuge in a shelter after a warning siren sounded twice. The Israeli army said it suspected an aerial infiltration from Lebanon into northern Israel, although it later said it had not identified any aerial intrusions from the north. More than 2,300 people in Israel and Gaza have been killed, with thousands of others injured, since Hamas militants launched brutal attacks on Saturday, prompting Israel to declare war and to form an emergency government. U.S. President Joe Biden reaffirmed that he and his national security team are working day and night on the conflict, and said he and Vice President Kamala Harris had spoken again Wednesday with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
And this moment, we have to be crystal clear. There is no justification for terrorism, no excuse, and the type of terrorism that was exhibited here is just beyond the pale, beyond the pale. As I said yesterday, my commitment to Israel's security and the safety of the Jewish people is unshakable.
Biden dispatched his top diplomat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, to Israel as a sign of solidarity. Before departing to the conflict region, Blinken had this to say to any country that might try to take advantage of the situation.
The President has deployed, as you know, the world's largest aircraft carrier group to the region to make very clear our intent to deter anyone contemplating any further aggression against Israel.
Blinken said that the U.S. is also focused on its own citizens, that 22 Americans have died, and that number could go up. The White House said 17 Americans were still missing, and the administration had no information on their condition. At the United Nations in New York, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he is in constant contact with leaders in the Middle East and is worried about a spillover of the conflict in the region.
I am concerned about the recent exchange of fire along the Blue Line and recent reported attacks from southern Lebanon. I appeal to all parties and those who have an influence over those parties to avoid any further escalation and spillover.
Guterres also called for Hamas to release all Israeli hostages, emphasizing that civilians must always be protected and that international humanitarian law must be upheld. He said that about 220,000 Palestinians are now sheltered in 92 UN facilities across Gaza, and that UN premises and hospitals, schools, and clinics must never be targeted. Later Wednesday at the White House, Biden joined a roundtable with Jewish community leaders to express his condolences and his unwavering support for Israel following the Hamas terror attacks. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
In addition to the ongoing diplomacy, VOA's Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb is reporting that an A-10 squadron of fighter planes has arrived in the Middle East from Arizona, and another squadron from Georgia that is already in the region will be staying longer than previously planned. The diplomatic responses and pledges of support are but one part of this multidimensional conflict, an important part to be sure, but one that often misses the day-to-day realities for the people who live in the area now ravaged by war. The death toll in the Israel-Hamas conflict continues to soar, with more than 2,300 people killed in Israel and Gaza, as bombs pummel Gaza and rockets still target Israel. And as VOA's Jan Boyschat reports, the battles appear to be escalating.
Right now, the Iron Dome here in southern Israel is hitting some missiles that were shot from Gaza. We can listen to the sound. It's very, very loud, and we can see it crossing the sky. I'm in Ashkelon right now, and the city is absolutely empty.
Today, 2 rockets hit this city as the death toll on both sides of this conflict rises. About 7 kilometers from Gaza, ambulances stand by as bombs crash in and out. We can also hear gunfire, and Israeli soldiers are on edge. Some say Hamas will continue ground assaults. Bombs pound the Gaza Strip day and night, where 2 million civilians live. They have no way out, and people we spoke to today inside Gaza say humanitarian aid is not getting in. In the West Bank, Palestinian men from Gaza say they can also not go home because the war began while they were working outside the Gaza Strip. Some say when Hamas attacked Israel on Saturday, they knew it would be a disaster for their families. Now, in less than a week, more than 2,300 people are dead. Thousands more are injured. Hundreds are held hostage or missing, and the war continues to escalate. Jan Boyschat, VOA News, Ashkelon, Israel, and the West Bank.
Families of Israeli hostages are desperately seeking answers regarding the safety of their loved ones. As Israel continues to pound the Gaza Strip, Heather Murdoch, VOA regional correspondent and Istanbul bureau chief, was on the ground outside of Jerusalem when she spoke with Kim Lewis about the desperate situation of civilians.
For civilians in where I'm standing right now, the Israeli side, a lot of the southern Israel has been evacuated, and people who are still there are living mostly inside, sometimes underground if they can, and quite afraid and quite tense. I mean, there is just near constant battle. We just came from a bit further south, closer to Gaza, and there was fire from both sides that, I mean, we were there for an hour and it pretty much didn't stop. A lot of the fire from the Gaza Strip coming into Israel is caught by the Israeli Iron Dome, their famous air defense system, but not all of it. There were rockets that landed in a nearby city, Ashkelon, today, and the death toll continues to rise to more than 1,000 on both sides. So civilians are basically afraid and so angry. I've covered a lot of wars. I've been covering wars for 14 years now, and I have never been in a war where civilians were so angry at the civilians on the other side and using language of annihilation for their enemy.
What are people saying about the hostage situation?
The situation of hostages, Israeli hostages in Gaza has changed a bit today because there were about 150 known hostages or believed to be hostages yesterday. Now some of the people that were believed to be hostages are now confirmed dead. There was a man we spoke to yesterday whose niece was missing from a kibbutz right next to the border with Gaza, and she went missing, and her friend and neighbor was taken hostage and later was set free for no reason. And so they assumed the niece was with them, but actually they found her body when they uncovered many other Israeli bodies and the bodies of Hamas fighters in the kibbutz today. The hostages that are believed to still be in Gaza and still be hostages are still missing with very little information. And, every day their prospect of getting out alive is worse, and the prospect of getting out untraumatized, of course, is not even a possibility at this point. There's also a lot of anger and fear of that. But I also don't want to forget that the people inside of Gaza, the civilians there, and we spoke to some of those today too, while they're not hostages in the traditional sense, they are literally trapped inside the area. And while the Israeli government says to the civilians, you should leave, this is what you should do, there's nowhere to go. There's no border that's open. So they are also trapped in this terrible situation as well.
Yes, and also President Biden confirmed that U.S. citizens are among the hostages captured by Hamas. What is reaction on the ground to the U.S. hostages?
Well, from the Israeli side, when they talk about the hostages and the so many nationals from so many countries being among them, it's in some ways boosts the claim of righteousness. You know, both sides in this war feel like they are in the moral right. And when something like this happens, then not just to Israelis, but people all over the world have been taken hostage, it stands as proof that these actions were terror and not military. However, this is, a really unfortunate part of this war in that the civilians aren't really fighting the war. And they really, I spoke to a bunch of men from Gaza today, and they really wish that hadn't happened. Why do they have to do things that are just anger and destroy the conscience of people all over the world? It's actually, a horrific act for people on both sides.
That was Heather Murdoch, VOA's regional correspondent and Istanbul bureau chief. She spoke with VOA's Kim Lewis. And here are some other stories we're following from around the world. Award-winning Indian author Arundhati Roy is facing prosecution after giving a speech 13 years ago, disputing the idea that Kashmir is an integral part of India. The decision has faced disapproval from proponents of free speech and those opposing the current administration of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which has drawn criticism for its record on free speech. Leaders in Chad are pleading for help as the Central African nation is struggling to meet the humanitarian needs of 2 million foreign and displaced people seeking refuge there, many of them women and children fleeing violence and increasing hardship in neighboring Sudan. And Republicans in the House of Representatives Wednesday nominated Steve Scalise for Speaker of the House, a role formerly held by Kevin McCarthy, who was ousted last week. Scalise must now gain approval of the full House, where Republicans hold a slim majority. An update on a story we've been following here on International Edition. A Nairobi court this week temporarily suspended a Kenyan government plan to deploy 1,000 police officers to Haiti. The case was brought to court by 3 petitioners, including opposition politician and constitutional lawyer Ekuru Akut, who told VOA the proposed deployment was unconstitutional. Analysts say there may be a way for the government to argue its case. VOA's Nairobi bureau chief Miriam Diallo has the story.
The ruling by the High Court of Kenya puts a hold on the deployment of police officers to Haiti or any other country pending another hearing scheduled for October 24th. This will allow government officials to respond to the arguments made against them in the petition, the ruling shared with VOA says. The petitioners include opposition politician and constitutional lawyer Ekuru Aukot. He told VOA that although he cannot really discuss a matter that is actively in court, he maintains that the government's plan to send 1,000 of its police to Haiti is not in line with the Constitution.
The whole thing is very unprocedural. It is unconstitutional. And for me, as a person who sat in the committee of experts as the CEO to direct the writing of our current constitution, of course, it behoves me to be able to actually point out unconstitutional decisions.
The UN Security Council last week approved a Kenya-led multinational security force aimed at helping the troubled Caribbean nation. While many in Kenya question their country's lead role in this mission, some have been supportive of President William Ruto. He says it's a mission for humanity and is of special significance and critical urgency for Kenyans. A representative from the Ruto government told us on Tuesday that the government will argue its case and abide by the court's decision. Meanwhile, in the petition shared with VOA, Alcott cites 2 articles in the Kenyan Constitution. They say that only Kenya Defense Forces can be deployed to another country and that the National Police Service will only function throughout Kenya. But
there is sort of an inkling in a section 107 and 108 of the National Police Service Act. And it says the National Police may, it's very discretionary, may be deployed, but it has to be upon a request from a reciprocating government. And that's what one of the gist of the question that we are raising, which I don't want to discuss in details because it's a matter for determination.
Haiti did ask for help, but didn't ask Kenya specifically, and there is no reciprocal agreement between the 2 governments. Francis Hayundi, assistant professor of international law at the United States International University Africa in Nairobi, told VOA. Hayundi says the court's decision is in line with the petitioner's argument on what processes had not been followed.
For me, looking at the petition and looking at what the laws provide, it makes sense because as it is, procedure was not followed, or better yet, not all information is being given that would make us know why Kenya is getting involved.
But Hayundi notes there may be a way for the government to make its case.
Actually, there's provision for the police force to be deployed outside the country. However, this is a decision that has to be taken by the National Security Council, and it is informed by Article 240 of the Kenyan Constitution. So far, we have not heard of any decision being taken by the National Security Council to deploy the police. So I think that is where the issue is.
He says the NSC is a body established by the Constitution that includes the President, his deputy, a few cabinet secretaries, the Attorney General, the Director General of the National Intelligence Service, and the Inspector General of the National Police Service. And so far, they've only mostly heard from the President and a few cabinet secretaries, making the case for deployment. Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Nairobi.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. Coming up, we'll hear about a referendum in Australia that seeks to change the lives of First Nations people. But will it really do what its advocates say it will? Now we're in Brussels, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has taken his pitch for more military aid directly to dozens of defense leaders. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Meghani reports.
For the first time, Zelensky appeared in person as the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group met in Brussels, noting next week will mark the 600th day of his resistance against Russia.
And today, no one can say for sure how many more days we will have to defend our independence.
His presence underscored growing concerns about cracks in what has been strong international backing for Ukraine. Zelensky noted allies are now under pressure to also send weapons to Israel for the Hamas war.
Can do both, and we will do both.
Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin says support for Ukraine remains strong. Sagar Meghani at the White House.
And finally today, Australia will hold a referendum on Saturday recognizing First Nations people in the Constitution. The proposal would set up a powerful advisory body called the Indigenous Voice to help the federal parliament shape laws and policies. Critics of the move insist it would be divisive and have little to do with addressing disadvantage in Aboriginal communities. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
Will I grow up in a country that hears my voice? Will I live as long as other Australians? Will I get to go to a good school? Will I be able to learn my people's language?
Australia's constitution doesn't recognise its original inhabitants. Supporters of reform want to change the nation's founding document to set up the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. It would be a committee of First Nations Australians that would advise federal parliament to help to shape the laws and policies that affect disadvantaged communities. Indigenous people comprise just over 3% of the Australian population, but they suffer disproportionately high rates of ill health, poverty, unemployment and imprisonment, despite decades of policies costing many billions of dollars. On average, First Nations Australians live 8 years less than other groups. Some campaigners believe previous policies have been based on paternalism rather than partnership. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the voice would make a positive and practical difference to the lives of Australia's original inhabitants. However, the Yes campaign that Albanese has championed is behind in the opinion polls. But the Prime Minister told local media that he was confident of victory.
It is certainly winnable. This is the right thing to do. This is consistent with the Australian principle of a fair go.
Not all agree.
I'll be voting no, because this will not unite us. This will divide us.
The No campaign is comprised of a broad range of dissenters. It includes radical Indigenous groups that want the voice to have real, not symbolic authority and to have the power of veto over government decisions that the current voice proposal doesn't contain. Other critics insist the proposal could create delays and dysfunction within government, while criticising the absence of specific details about the size, role and function of the advisory panel. Some opponents say that by enshrining a permanent Aboriginal presence in the heart of government, there's a presumption Indigenous people will always be disadvantaged and need special treatment. Voting in Australia is compulsory. About 17 million people are registered to vote. Only 8 out of 44 referendums have been passed since 1901. The last referendum was held in November 1999, when Australians rejected the plan to sever their constitutional ties to the British monarchy and become a republic. Phil Mercer, VOA News, Sydney.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Carish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
When the head of the Norwegian Nobel Committee recently announced the 2023 winner of the prestigious Peace Prize, Berit Reiss-Andersen uttered the slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," as she declared Iranian human rights defender Narges Mohammadi the winner. That slogan rang throughout the nationwide protests following the tragic death of Mahsa Amini in the custody of Iran's morality police in September 2022. Narges Mohammadi has stood up to the Iranian regime for decades, fighting for those principles on behalf of Iranian women and men, including religious minorities and political prisoners. And she has paid a heavy price. First arrested in 1998, Ms. Mohammadi has been repeatedly imprisoned. Currently, she is serving a lengthy sentence in Tehran's notorious Evin prison. In a statement, President Joe Biden congratulated Narges Mohammadi and spoke of her unshakable courage. She has endured repeated arrests, persecution, and torture at the hands of the Iranian regime, yet Ms. Mohammadi's advocacy and determination have only grown stronger, he said. The world still hears the clarion voice of Narges Mohammadi calling for freedom and equality. He urged Iran to release her and her fellow gender equality advocates from captivity. President Biden noted that the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Ms. Mohammadi the same week that horrifying reports emerged about Iran's so-called morality police assaulting 16-year-old Armita Garavand in Tehran for not wearing a hijab. The people of Iran refuse to be silenced or intimidated as they fight for a free and democratic future for their nation, and their peaceful movement, Woman, Life, Freedom, demanding respect for their human rights, has brought hope to the people of the world, he said. President Biden pointed out that the United States is leading a diplomatic initiative at the United Nations to highlight and promote accountability for the Iranian regime's abuses. The U.S. has also deployed anti-censorship tools to make it easier for Iranians to access the Internet and has sanctioned more than 100 Iranian individuals and entities responsible for supporting supporting the regime's oppression. The United States, President Biden declared, will continue to stand with Ms. Mohammadi, with the brave people of Iran, and with all those around the world who are working with resilience and resolve to make our world more equal and more free.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Concerns that some lawmakers want to shift aid for Ukraine over to Israel.
Both Ukraine and Israel are important. Both need American military assistance, and it's important to our national security interests, let alone theirs, but ours too, that they get that assistance.
Plus, Ukraine's president meets with NATO defense ministers hoping to shore up cracks in what has been an overwhelming support for its efforts to battle Russian aggression.
President Zelensky informed the allies about the urgent needs of the Ukrainian army. This is a very important stage. He also said that Ukrainian army needs time and the progress would be seen.
And later in the program, could North Korea be assisting Russia with restocking its depleted ammunition supply? Today is Wednesday, October 11th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening. I'm Lori London in Washington. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky brought his appeal for military aid in the form of air defense, artillery, and ammunition to NATO headquarters in Brussels, where he attended talks Wednesday with NATO defense ministers. For details, I spoke with Anna Chernikova in Kyiv. So, Anna, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky still on the move, still doing his best to drum up support where there seem to be some growing concerns about cracks in what has been staunch international backing for Kyiv in its war against Russia's invasion, worries that Ukrainian forces, haven't made measurable progress in the counteroffensive, now winter closing in. He made a surprise visit to Belgium, Brussels, Wednesday. What can you tell us about what you're hearing about that?
Well, yes, exactly. He is in Brussels with an announced visit. This is the first time he's participating in the Ramstein meeting offline. Previously, he was participating only online. Also, he will be at the meeting of the defense ministers of NATO countries and also Ukraine NATO Council. And he already met with the Prime Minister of Belgium. He already met with the head of Pentagon, Lloyd Austin. And at the meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, Mr. Austin assured him that the United States will continue to supply Ukraine with weapons. And also we've heard the announcement about the new package of military aid to Kyiv. President Zelensky's office reported that President Zelensky thanked the U.S. for the new military aid package, and also President Zelensky informed the allies about the urgent needs of the Ukrainian army. As you mentioned, winter is coming, and of course, this is a very important stage in this war between Ukraine and Russia. President Zelensky also said that Ukrainian army needs time and the progress would be seen, but it's not a quick progress, which is understandable due to all of the difficulties at the front line. Also, President Zelensky reported about the very, as he said, meaningful meetings during his visit to Brussels. Particularly, Secretary General NATO, Mr. Stoltenberg, assured again that Ukraine will become a NATO member, and he also mentioned that all members of NATO agreed on that. At least this is what was said today. And finally, during the meeting with Prime Minister of Belgium, President Zelensky said that it was quite successful decisions made, that the leaders discussed how the frozen assets of Russia can be used to compensate the damage of war in Ukraine and Russian aggression in Ukraine, and how to do it right now, not to wait. He said, I will quote him, that Belgium has become the first country to initiate the practice of using frozen frozen Russian assets to support defense against Russian terror. This was the quote from President Zelensky. And also he specified that these funds will be directed to security assistance to Ukraine rapid reconstruction projects in the regions of Ukraine.
And I understand that when President Zelensky was speaking entering NATO headquarters, he had a comment noting the Israel war.
President Zelensky mentioned the current situation in Israel and current war in Israel. He said that this is not quite the same what's happening in Ukraine and in Israel. However, it's similar. He called Russia a terrorist as well as Hamas representatives a terrorist, and basically he compared Putin with Hamas. At this point, we know already that at least 3 Ukrainians were killed in Israel and some more are considered missing. So definitely Ukraine is keeping a very close eye on what's happening in Israel, and definitely President Zelensky also mentioned that Ukraine understands exactly what Israel is going through.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. We thank you as always.
Thank you.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who is also in Brussels meeting with a group of allies in support of Ukraine, announced an additional $200 million in aid, as we heard, for Ukraine's defense against Russia. My colleague Steve Karish spoke with VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, who is traveling with the defense secretary.
They are planning to show Ukraine that the United States and all of Ukraine's Western allies are still very much committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as this takes. And this is going to be hard to do because as Secretary Austin is heading to Brussels, there is still not any additional funding that has been passed through Congress because Congress is still waiting to get a Speaker of the House so that they can continue to pass bills. I think that the Pentagon is hedging on the fact that there is still about $5 billion left that the United States has authorized to give Ukraine, and they are going to be providing some more of that funding at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Secretary Austin was speaking to reporters, and he confirmed that there would be another U.S. aid package that was announced. I had been speaking earlier today to multiple U.S. officials that confirmed to VOA that the U.S. is going to be providing up to $200 million in additional military aid for Ukraine in a package that's going to include much of the same that we've been seeing over the last several weeks. It's going to have more AIM-9 missiles. It's going to have more HIMARS munitions. We're not talking about those ATACMS, those super long-range munitions. We're talking more of the Gimler medium-range munitions, but there's still going to be more of those that they need. We're talking about anti-tank missiles, 155-millimeter rounds, 105-millimeter rounds, counter-drone equipment, electronic warfare equipment, demolition equipment, because there's a lot of Russian obstacles in place and minefields that they need to get through. They've made some gains over the past weeks, but there's still a lot more to go. And so a lot of this package is going to be much of the same because that's what Ukraine needs, especially in these last few weeks before winter sets in.
And I think any discussion about defense, about foreign aid, about the Pentagon in general, we have to be discussing Israel as well. How do the recent events there figure into the Pentagon's calculations with Ukraine and just sort of what the Pentagon is doing in general?
Well, so the situation in Israel and the situation in Ukraine are not linked, but it's important to note that for this past year, and Israel has been the number 2 recipient of U.S. military aid. They have between $3 and $4 billion of military aid going to them, and Ukraine had about $44 billion to date since the start of the war, since Russia invaded last year. So, I mean, clearly Ukraine has a lot more because they were in a war of aggression against Russia. But Israel has had a drumbeat of attacks over the past several years that the U.S. has supported. What is important for U.S. officials in this instance is they want the world to know that this is not just your normal Palestinian attack on Israel. Officials are saying that this is Islamic State level savagery. They say that some of these Hamas militants have been murdering kids in front of their parents. Hundreds of Israelis have been killed. They launched thousands of missiles into Israel. So it requires a very strong response. And so officials have said that planes have already taken off from the U.S., surging weapons to get to Israel. And the weapons that they say that they need right now are air defense weapons, just like Ukraine needs. The difference is Israel has the Iron Dome, and so the interceptors for the Iron Dome will be surged to Israel. Right now, the Ukrainians are using Patriot defense batteries, so they have Patriot missiles that are going to them. But, should the United States need to move a Patriot over to help support Israel, there could be a, conflicting interest there when they would both need those munitions for the Patriots. And it should also be noted that Raytheon is the U.S. company that provides interceptors for both the Iron Dome and the Patriot. So their capacity will also come into question in the coming days.
That was VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb speaking with my colleague Steve Karish. Well, the race to elect a new Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives is underway. As VOA's congressional correspondent Katherine Gypson reports, the unpredictable race delays an already imperiled U.S. aid package to Ukraine.
Even before Speaker Kevin McCarthy was removed from office last week, the White House's $24 billion aid request had stalled in the Republican-majority U.S. House of Representatives at a key point in the war. George Washington University professor Colin Cleary.
Ukraine is in the middle of an offensive to try and reclaim stolen territory, and that is intensive of use of military articles. And so the inability to resupply will obviously result in that offensive grinding to a slow ebb or even a halt.
Opposition to Ukraine aid grew among House Republicans over the summer, and it will be difficult for any candidate to become Speaker without winning over those critics. Republican Jim Jordan, a candidate for Speaker, has said aid to Ukraine is not a priority.
The most pressing issue on Americans' minds is not Ukraine. It is the border situation, and it is crime on the streets, and everybody knows that.
An October 2023 poll by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs found that 60% of Americans still support the U.S. sending aid to Ukraine. American voter Cindy Fallman.
It's expensive, and our country has its own share of problems right now, and a lot of people would like to see money go in different directions. But I just feel like, as the United States has really helped so many people in so many countries in their time of need, and this is a critical one.
The White House reportedly is exploring the possibility of linking aid to Ukraine with aid for the war in Israel. McCarthy, who is still supported by many lawmakers to become Speaker again, said Israel should come first.
You're thinking some type of game to play? I think right now Israel was just attacked. I would put Israel's supplemental on the table, on the floor right now.
Speaker candidate Steve Scalise, who has been supportive of aid to Ukraine in the past, said lawmakers should move swiftly to elect a new leader.
We've got to get back on track. This is a dangerous world right now.
Republicans will hold their vote for the Speaker post on Wednesday. Until the full U.S. House of Representatives elects a Speaker, no legislation can be passed. Katherine Gypson, VOA News, Capitol Hill.
And Katherine also looked at public opinion on U.S. aid to Ukraine. She caught up with several visitors to Washington to find out how they feel about continued support.
What are your views on aid to Ukraine? We've sent billions of dollars there already. Would you like to see more sent over?
Yes, I would. I think humanitarian, for humanitarian reasons, it's very sad what's going on to families and people there, and I think we need to help them.
Why do you think that there's so much growing concern over the amount of aid that we've sent there?
Well, it's expensive, and our country has its own share of problems right now, and a lot of people would like to see money go in different directions. But I just feel like, as the United States has really helped so many people in so many countries in their time of need, and this is a critical one.
We're trying to elect a new Speaker of the House. Ukraine is one of the big issues. A lot of Republicans say that we shouldn't be spending any more money to them, that oversight of the aid is an important topic, that we need a clearer strategy for winning in Ukraine. Where do you fall on that issue?
I'm all for funding the Ukrainian war as much as they need. Well, because of Russia and China, we certainly don't want them taking over that area of the world.
U.S. aid to Ukraine, there's a supplemental request from the White House House, new round of billions of dollars in aid that's coming under a lot of criticism from the Republican majority U.S. House of Representatives, concerns that we've sent too much money to Ukraine, that there's not a clear strategy for winning there. What would you like to see lawmakers do?
I'd like to see them improve the aid to Ukraine because I think in a way it helps protect the United States citizenship because any aggression by Putin and his forces is just going to keep coming. If we don't stop him there, he's going to move into Romania. If we don't stop him there, he's going to move into Poland. So, I mean, this is kind of a strong point that needs to be made as far as an international leadership to other countries in Europe to say, hey, we're behind this 100%.
A lot of controversy about sending more aid over to Ukraine. Where do you fall on that issue?
I'm glad to see us supporting a country that I think has been unfairly attacked by the Russians. I'm very glad to see the ethics and the integrity in that, caring for someone that needs assistance.
Meanwhile, White House National Security Spokesman John Kirby told VOA the Biden administration will do everything it can to continue working with Congress to secure the aid.
It is important that Ukraine continue to get the aid that it needs. They are involved in still a counteroffensive and facing Russian aggression on their own soil. And we don't want to see a single lapse.
And as for some lawmakers wanting to shift U.S. military aid to Israel, which is now at war after the murderous weekend attacks by Hamas.
Both countries need U.S. military assistance in terms of weapons and capabilities. Both are under assault. Both have every right to defend themselves and their citizens. And in that defense, our national security interests are actually benefited. We're going to continue to have those conversations with Congress.
You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Recent satellite photos show a sharp increase in rail traffic along the North Korea-Russia border, which, according to a U.S. think tank, could indicate the North is supplying depleted munitions to Russia. The assessment came from a website run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. VOA's Kim Lewis spoke with Alexis Dudden, professor of history at the University of Connecticut, to gain some insight into this report.
They're really pretty stark. It appears that there are 73 freight cars which crossed the border from North Korea into Russia, very small land border there, on October 5th. They're covered, so CSIS, the organization, rightly states that they cannot be sure what's under the covers, and yet, all probability suggests that they are the ammunitions that were widely suggested at the September 13th summit between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. I think important to understand is that throughout its history, the development of munitions in North Korea has been on Soviet-era standards, because those were the models used to develop the munitions. And so above all, Russia needs, ammunition and supplies that fit its already existing equipment. So if in fact those 73 cars are carrying Russia's needed weaponry, then that would be logical. Other than that, nobody really knows.
U.S. and South Korean officials have warned that North Korea and Russia would face consequences if they went ahead with the reported weapons transfer deal in violation with the UN Security Council resolution that bans all weapons trade involving North Korea. So has there been any reaction yet?
Well, I think Pyongyang, and maybe less so Moscow, they have very different world outlooks, but Pyongyang is all about regime survival. And the entirety of state sovereignty is embodied in the Kim family. And at this juncture, the United States, our sole policy would appear, you can't do that. No, I don't mean for that to sound as critical as it is, but there's nothing other than sort of repeated, well, you can't do that. And that's not a policy. So we either engage, which is my preference, and really get at it, or we do something horrible, such as a preemptive action, which some suggest is the right course of action. However, that has cataclysmic consequences, and I don't think anybody wants that. So we, the United States, have no real outlook, and now everything is eclipsed by the Israel Hamas nightmare, and Washington remains focused on Ukraine. So with absence of policy towards North Korea other than you can't do that, I don't think Pyongyang is going to care at all, and Moscow will simply benefit from Washington's distractions.
And also, South Korean officials said North Korean weapons provided to Russia had already been used in Ukraine. Has this been proven? Has North Korea already been supplying arms to Russia?
That's difficult for anyone really to know. South Korea has just appointed a new defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who is very hardline. And in recent days, he is calling for South Korea to take definitive kinetic measures against North Korea. So whether that is all talk remains to be seen. In terms of North Korea's already having supplied the Russian military, I think about a year ago, forgive me, I'm not quite sure, there were some satellite images of ships going through the Sea of Okhotsk, going the sort of long way around to resupply Russian troops in Ukraine at Crimea. Whether or not those weapons came from North Korea, I think is something that remains to be seen. Certainly, if there's new ship traffic through what is international waters north of Japan and around, we'll find out. And in this way, it sort of parallels. We know that last week the United States resupplied Ukraine with seized weapons that were made in Iran en route to Russia. And it's kind of who's giving bullets to which side and where do they come from, I think is, for after the conflict taking apart for historians. At the moment, clearly both sides are upping the ante.
Alexis Dudden, professor of history at the University of Connecticut, speaking with my colleague, Kim Lewis. Analysts say Azerbaijan's capture of the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave from ethnic Armenians is the latest success of an alliance between Turkey and Azerbaijan. But that alliance, observers say, is challenging Russia's grip on the Caucasus as Moscow is distracted by its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Dorian Jones looks at the situation from Istanbul.
Azerbaijani forces' capture of the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh enclave from ethnic Armenians came after 3 decades of on-off conflict. Turkey's training of Azerbaijani forces using Turkish-made drones proved decisive, as did Moscow's failure to intervene in support of its Armenian ally. Zao Gazimov is a professor of history and a specialist on Russia at Bonn University.
Russia became more vulnerable in its internal politics and in its exterior strategies, also in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, in the Middle East, and that creates new spaces and new possibilities also for other regional powers in partly to regain their positions, partly to become new leverages of influence.
Decades of simmering tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, experts say, allowed Moscow to exert influence over the region by playing both sides against each other. The defeat of the Armenian-backed forces is a significant loss for Moscow. Caucasus specialist Galia Lindenstrauss in Tel Aviv.
It will influence, at least in the short term, its ability to act or to have clout with these two states, with Azerbaijan and Armenia. But I believe that in the long run, Russia does see this area as strategic importance, does see it as its backyard, will not allow too much independence on the side of Armenia and Azerbaijan.
But any attempt by Moscow to reassert its dominance in the Caucasus will face competition as Ankara continues to deepen ties with Baku. Turkey is now militarily committed to defend Azerbaijan in the event of any attack. Mesut Jarshan is a presidential advisor at Istanbul's Yeditepe University.
Turkey aimed to be establishing peace and stability in Caucasus. You look at here, Russia is here. They invaded just in a short time in Georgia. And then we see what's happening in the Crimea and also in the Ukraine.
With Turkey beset by economic woes, deepening ties with energy-rich Azerbaijan is a key goal. Turkey also wants to turn the Caucasus into an alternative energy export route for Central Asian countries and break Russia's tight grip on energy distribution. Observers say Ankara and Moscow have a long history of diffusing their disputes by using economic issues to find common ground. Onur Ishchi is a Russian affairs expert at Istanbul's Kara Has University.
I study Russian-Turkish relations, the past 100 years of Russian-Turkish relations, and I see episodes of brief moments of conflict that have been so carefully managed. Turkey and Russia successfully, for the past 100 years, used economy to manage and cooperation to manage these geopolitical disputes, which they have many on the table.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russian leader Vladimir Putin have developed a close working relationship, much of which has involved managing conflicting rivalries. The situation in the Caucasus may prove to be their biggest challenge. Dorian Jones, VOA News, Istanbul.
And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage of Ukraine and news from around the world, 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA's Lori London.
This is the voice of America. Washington, D.C.
On the show today, President Joe Biden reaffirms support for Israel.
We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack.
Plus, the U.S. Secretary of Defense is headed to Brussels for the meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group with news of a U.S. aid package for Kyiv.
So they are planning to show Ukraine that the United States and all of Ukraine's Western allies are still very much committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes.
And later Tuesday was Election Day in Liberia, and a closer look at China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. Today is Wednesday, October 11th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. VOA is on the ground in Gaza and in Israel. That story in a few minutes. We begin, though, at the White House. President Biden said on Tuesday that he will ask Congress to take urgent action to help defuse Middle East tensions. This after Hamas attacked Israel over the weekend, killing more than 1,000 people, including at least 14 Americans. Analysts say the possibility that Americans are among those being held hostage by the militant Palestinian group complicates the situation. VOA's Anita Powell reports from the White House.
President Joe Biden minced no words in describing the shock and horror of Hamas' surprise weekend attack on Israel.
This was an act of sheer evil. More than 1,000 civilians slaughtered, not just killed, slaughtered in Israel. Among them, at least 14 American citizens killed. Parents butchered using their bodies to try to protect their children. Stomach-turning reports of babies being killed. Entire families slain.
And he clarified Washington's stance on Israel's counteroffensive.
We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack. There's no justification for terrorism. There's no excuse.
To that end, he said the U.S. has sent a strike carrier group to the region, and he says he'll ask Congress, once a new House Speaker is elected, to take urgent action to fund the national security requirements of our critical partners. Analysts say the carnage has touched a raw nerve at the White House, which illuminated itself in Israel's color over the tragedy. Daniel Byman is a senior fellow with the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
There may be Americans captured by a terrorist group, and that's got to be a priority of any American president. And the second issue is coming to terms with the deaths of Americans in a terrorist attack in Israel. Add to that all the complexities of a very difficult regional situation. And it involves not only Israel and Hamas, but the possibility of Hezbollah and Iranian involvement. So President Biden is trying to wrestle with all these.
VOA asked the White House whether Biden asked Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to exercise restraint in his military response. John Kirby is Director of Strategic Communications for the National Security Council.
And nobody wants to see innocent life taken. And there, as I said, there's been too much of it. One of the great things about our relationship with Israel is that we're two vibrant democracies, and we mutually believe in things like the respect for innocent life and the rule of law. And we're always stronger together, our two countries, when we show that to the world, that we do respect innocent life and that we do respect the not only the rule of law, but the law of war.
U.S. adversaries were quick to point blame. Russia's President Vladimir Putin said, "Unfortunately, we can see a sharp deterioration of the situation in the Middle East. I think that many will agree with me that this is a clear example of the failure of the policy of the United States in the Middle East, which tried to monopolize the resolution of the conflict, but, unfortunately, was not concerned with finding compromises acceptable to both sides." Kirby said conflict in Israel won't take Washington's eye off other threats, wherever they are.
Any nation who might think that somehow the United States is going to get distracted should think again. We are a large enough, big enough, powerful enough country, economically viable enough. In fact, the economy is incredibly strong right now that we can look after our national security interests and those of our allies and partners anywhere around the world.
Nor, Biden said, will he walk away from Israel. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
An update from the Pentagon coming shortly. Now, though, as Israel continues its retaliation against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the surrounding areas have been evacuated, and the families of at least 150 hostages inside Gaza are growing increasingly terrified. VOA's Heather Murdoch is there, and she reports that Israelis are growing increasingly angry at their own government's reaction to what's becoming a devastating war for both sides.
Israelis living in the areas surrounding the Gaza Strip have been evacuated, and rockets continue to shoot out of the enclave. The more than 2 million Palestinian people inside are trapped, as it is pummeled by heavy weaponry day and night. Among the civilians in Gaza are as many as 150 Israeli hostages. Family members are terrified that their loved ones will not be rescued. This is Solar's Adolfo, whose niece went missing the day of the initial attacks. He believes she was taken hostage.
I don't know how it is going to end, but the end will not be a happy end. For nobody. It's not a happy end. For nobody.
Humanitarian groups inside Gaza say the crisis is deepening for civilians, already cut off from the world, and now cut off from outside resources like electricity, water, and food. In Jerusalem, about an hour and a half from Gaza, and still close enough to sometimes take rocket fire, many Israelis are enraged by the conflict, saying despite their government's famed security prowess, it failed to protect them. Others in this market blame the Palestinian people as a whole, saying the two sides of this conflict have never been more at odds. Nir Barashi is an Israeli citizen who is planning to report for military service soon.
I say it again, or us or them. We can stop. We need to eat them and eat them strong.
Hamas, the militant group that launched the surprise attack on Saturday, rules in Gaza. Hundreds of civilians on both sides have been killed, and thousands have been injured. Outside the Gaza Strip, debris from the first days of this new war remains on the abandoned streets, as Israel mounts its forces for what may soon be even more of an escalation. VOA News reporting from Jerusalem, Kfar Daniel, and southern Israel.
And here are some other stories we're following from around the world. Russia failed on Tuesday in its controversial bid to reclaim its seat on the UN Human Rights Council after it was suspended by the General Assembly in April of 2022 following its invasion of Ukraine. Leading economists gathered in Marrakesh on Tuesday for the International Monetary Fund's annual conference. Their message was clear. The world economy is beginning to slump as fissures between East and West widen. IMF chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas said the global economy is limping, not sprinting. The IMF predicts that global economic growth will slow in 2024 to 2.9% from this year's 3%. And authorities in Malawi have started distributing free corn and money to more than 4 million people facing food shortages, largely because of the impact of Cyclone Freddy, which washed away thousands of acres of crops in March. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is in Brussels for the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting. This as American military planes full of supplies are departing for Israel, and as the Pentagon formally declares the recent change in government in Niger a coup. What does that mean for U.S. policy? I'm joined by VOA's Pentagon correspondent, Carla Babb.
So they are planning to show Ukraine that the United States and all of Ukraine's Western allies are still very much committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. And this is going to be hard to do because as Secretary Austin is heading to Brussels, there is still not any additional funding that has been passed through Congress because Congress is still waiting to get a Speaker of the House so that they can continue to pass bills. That brings up
my next question is, how can our allies take us seriously when we don't have leadership in place, when the Congress seems to take itself out of the picture?
Well, I think that the Pentagon is hedging on the fact that there is still about $5 billion left that the United States has authorized to give Ukraine, and they are going to be providing some more of that funding at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Secretary Austin was speaking to reporters today, and he confirmed that there would be another U.S. aid package that was announced. I had been speaking earlier today to multiple U.S. officials that confirmed to VOA that the U.S. is going to be providing up to $200 million in additional military aid for Ukraine.
And I think any discussion about defense, about foreign aid, about the Pentagon in general, we have to be discussing Israel as well. How do the recent events there figure into the Pentagon's calculations with Ukraine and just sort of what the Pentagon is doing in general?
Well, so the situation in Israel and the situation in Ukraine are not linked. What is important for U.S. officials in this instance is they want the world to know that this is not just your normal Palestinian attack on Israel. Officials are saying that this is Islamic State level savagery. They say that some of these Hamas militants have been murdering kids in front of their parents. Hundreds of Israelis have been killed. They launched thousands of missiles into Israel. So it requires a very strong response. And so officials have said that planes have already taken off from the U.S., surging weapons to get to Israel.
Carla, changing gears completely. Today, the Pentagon declared what happened in Niger about 6 weeks ago officially as a military coup. Can you tell us what that means for Pentagon policy going forward?
So at the moment, there's not much of a change for Pentagon policy in Niger. As officials explained to reporters today, the normal steps that the United States would make if it was going to designate a country a coup, they already started implementing those over the past several weeks. As you know, as we've discussed on this program, the United States has not been conducting any training of their Nigerian counterparts. They've not been conducting any counter-terror operations with their Nigerian counterparts. So for now, they are going to remain, U.S. forces are going to remain in country. And I asked today to get specifically how many U.S. forces are there, and there are still about 1,000 U.S. forces in country. But the designation of a coup just solidifies that there is not going to be any military-to-military cooperation with Niger. And the reason that the United States wanted to take this action now is because they say that over the past 2 months, they have exhausted all available avenues to preserve constitutional order. They said that the Constitution requires that a democratic leader be in place within 90 to 120 days, and they said that it's become very apparent that these new military leaders have no inkling and no desire to follow the constitutional order. In fact, that they told U.S. officials that they want to repeal the Constitution and create a new one. So that was kind of the breaking point for the United States, and that is why today the U.S. has designated this military takeover a coup.
Carla Babb is VOA's Pentagon correspondent. Carla, thanks for your reporting. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. China's Belt and Road Initiative has brought much-needed infrastructure to many places in Africa, and it has also brought crushing debt. We'll get that story from Nairobi in a few minutes. Now, we're off to the other side of the continent. Liberians went to the polls on Tuesday to choose their next legislators, senators, and president. Many showed up to exercise their right to vote despite delays and some procedural problems, as Sananu Tord reports from Monrovia.
Thousands of voters queue up at polling stations in Liberia's capital to select a president, senators, and legislators in the country's fourth national election since the end of the Civil War in 2003. Campaigning for the election has been marred by political violence, leaving many injured and at least 2 people dead. However, one observer says the initial processes on election day have been peaceful. Abdullahi Masayimbe Bangura is the observer group leader for the G7+ organization of conflict-affected countries.
Voting started here on time, so we hope it will continue that way. We've been to 4 stations, as I said, and all of the places we've been has been very peaceful, and the voters have been very orderly.
But there were exceptions. At the Monrovia Open Standard Church School Polling Center, tempers fled as voters argued with polling officers. The voters said a directive prohibiting the use of mobile phones in polling stations had not been communicated to them. Obed Zonde is a frustrated voter.
Sending text message to people will not solve the problem because there are other people, there are other Liberians that cannot read. It's not everybody that is educated. So why can you send text message to people? Why can you do a publicity that other people who are not educated to learn that just we did that just all bring from there?
At the FMCA school polling station in Monrovia, about 1,000 people stood in long queues for more than 6 hours after voting commenced. Despite the long wait, voters say they are eager to make their voices heard through the ballots.
I want to vote. I'm feeling tired now, but I won't go home. I'm going to vote because Liberia is all we have, and we need to vote and make the right decision.
The Electoral Commission says it will make sure all voters cast their ballots, even if it means keeping polling centers open past closing time. David Brown-Lansana is chair of the Electoral Commission.
We will still run the process. They just need to ensure that they are in the queue before the official voting time ends, which is at 6 o'clock, and all of those who are in the queue will get the chance to exercise their franchise.
About 2.5 million Liberians are registered to vote in Tuesday's elections. Liberia's National Elections Commission has urged voters to remain calm after voting and wait for official results to prevent disturbances. Sananu Tord, VOA News, Monrovia, Liberia.
It was revealed Tuesday in his New York fraud trial that former President Donald Trump acknowledged in a document that the size of his Trump Tower penthouse was a lot less than he later claimed. The AP's Julie Walker has that story.
Evidence shown at Donald Trump's New York civil fraud trial shows that he signed a 1994 document giving the true size of his Trump Tower penthouse at just under 11,000 square feet. It was listed later as 30,000 square feet on his financial statements that were given to banks, insurers, and others to make deals and secure loans. The evidence appeared in an email attachment shown during testimony from Alan Weisselberg, the former finance chief of Trump's company. The state attorney general's lawsuit alleges that Weisselberg engineered Trump's financial statements to meet his demands that they show increases in his net worth despite appraisals to the contrary. Trump denies any wrongdoing. Julie Walker, New York.
And finally, today, some 150 countries, many of them in Africa, have signed on to China's 10-year-old Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the BRI. And while the multi-billion-dollar global infrastructure project has helped bring roads, rails, and infrastructure, it has also left some countries saddled with debt. VOA's Nairobi Bureau Chief Miriama Diallo takes a look at the impact the initiative has had in Africa, including its many benefits and criticisms.
The standard gauge railway, which debuted in Kenya 6 years ago, was hailed by Kenyan officials as one of the biggest and most successful projects since the nation's independence in the 1960s. Travel time from Mombasa to Nairobi used to be up to 10 hours. Now, it only takes about 5 to 6 hours.
You're a businessman, you're going for an interview, saves your time.
Kenya borrowed some $5 billion from China to build railway lines connecting the port city of Mombasa to Nairobi and Nairobi to Naivasha. This is part of Chinese leader Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. It's a global infrastructure, trade, and telecommunications project that includes the goal of connecting Kenya to Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan. Vincent Kimosop is a Kenyan economist and consultant with Sovereign Insight in Nairobi.
The good side, one is that it's a framework for transportation of goods, transportation of cargo.
But Kimosop wishes some things were done differently for the railway, also called SGR.
I wish those who were responsible for negotiating the SGR would have actually looked at the repayment. It's a massive investment project. To have repayments be done in less than 20 or 30 years, that was quite ambitious.
During its construction, critics of the project protested its potential impact on wildlife. A part of this railway cuts through the Nairobi National Park. Over the last decade, some 150 countries have joined the initiative, including most African countries. China expert David Sachs.
Africa's population is growing significantly, and there's a need on the continent for more infrastructure. From the Chinese perspective, Africa is desirable because it wants to secure inputs for its manufacturing sector. And when it looks around the world, a lot of these, whether it's copper, cobalt, or other minerals, are found in Africa.
Countries such as Kenya, Ethiopia, and Zambia have seen massive Chinese-built infrastructure. But some countries have also been struggling with debt, including Zambia, a major Chinese borrower, which was the first country to default on its debt during the pandemic. The West has been critical of China for lending to poor countries and says it must quickly provide relief to those that ended up with unpayable debts.
Prompt action on debt is in China's interest.
Sachs notes a lot of countries joined BRI at a time when economic growth was quite robust, but that shifted.
The first shock, of course, was the COVID-19 pandemic, which really eviscerated global economic growth, but also hit the developing world particularly hard. And then the second one, I think, of course, was the war in Ukraine. Africa, major importers of food, as well as oil, prices for those commodities have gone up tremendously.
Back at the train station, many of these travelers mostly enjoyed their ride.
It is a safe mode of transport that we as Kenyans, we embrace it.
A recent Boston University study finds that lending to Africa by China has dropped to the lowest level in 2 decades. Analysts, however, say while the BRI is here to stay, Beijing may be moving towards smaller investments. Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Nairobi.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
There have been inflection points throughout history, noted Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the University of Texas at Austin. We had an inflection point after World War II. We had another one at the end of the Cold War. And we believe we're in one of those right now, he said.
You have a re-emerging great power competition that is primarily engaged in shaping what the future looks like. We've hit the end of the post-Cold War era, and now there's a competition on to shape what comes next. And at the same time, we have extraordinary transnational challenges, issues that are affecting people in every corner of our globe, including here in the United States, whether it's food security, whether it's climate, whether it's the way all of these emerging technologies are being used, whether it's mass migration.
And none of us, not even the United States, can effectively deal with these challenges alone, noted Secretary Blinken.
There's a premium on American engagement and American leadership because in the absence of us doing that, one of two things. Either someone else is going to do it, and probably not in a way that reflects our interests or values, or maybe just as bad, no one does it. And then you have a vacuum that's likely to be filled by bad things before it's filled by good things.
There's also a premium on finding new ways to cooperate with other countries toward a common purpose, said Secretary Blinken.
And here, it's my profound conviction that no country on earth has a greater ability to mobilize others in positive collective action than the United States.
And finally, said Secretary Blinken, we've made historic investments over the last few years to put us in a stronger position not only to do well by people at home, but also to compete effectively in the world. And if you have a strong foundation at home, it does wonders for your standing and your strength around the world. That's what we're seeing play out every single day around the world.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
To the conflict between Israel and Hamas, Russia continues its attacks in Ukraine.
Russian forces targeted the children's hospital in the city of Kherson.
Plus, of the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews who call Israel home, some generations feel threatened for a third time in their lifetimes.
There is a group of them that were children of the Holocaust. Some have evacuated to Israel, and now there is yet another trauma that they face. So 3 horrible instances of attacks on civilian life, 3 instances where you feel that your life is potentially threatened.
And later in the program, what Ukrainian farmers are saying about this year's harvest and what lies ahead. Today is Thursday, October 12th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening. I'm Lori London in Washington. A Russian official said Thursday that debris from a downed Ukrainian drone killed 3 people in the Belgorod region of Russia, while Moscow continued to pummel Ukraine with fresh missile strikes. I spoke with Anna Chernikova in Kyiv for the latest.
As President Zelensky reported just recently during his latest meeting with Ukrainian top military officials, there are 2 main front lines, and the most intensive front lines in Ukraine. It's in the south and in the east. In terms of the south front line, it was another overnight drone attack that mainly targeted the south area. Particularly, Russian forces used 33 drones to attack Ukraine over the night, and Ukrainian air defense shot down 28 of them. The port infrastructure of the Danube was damaged, which is next to Odessa, and also there are reports of the private houses damaged and also one person injured in the Odessa region. This attack also targeted Mykolaiv region, which is also in the south, as well as Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia and Cherkasy regions. What additionally on the south front line, we have reports from the Ukrainian armed forces that Russian forces targeted the children's hospital in the city of Kherson that was pretty much damaged, as well as also Kherson region was under the attack. Unfortunately, there is another report of the heat of the gymnasium high school in the Nikopol, which is Dnipropetrovsk region.
And we're hearing that a patrol vessel of Russia's Black Sea fleet was damaged near the port of Sevastopol in Crimea. What are you hearing about that? And is there any indication that this was an attack from Ukraine?
We are hearing here in Ukraine confirmation from the Ukrainian Navy that the battleship of the Russian Navy, which is called Pavel Derzhavin, was damaged in the Black Sea near occupied Sevastopol, which is in Crimea. However, Ukrainian officials do not provide any additional details, and they do not confirm that this is something that was organized and implemented by Ukraine.
And lastly, I wanted to ask you about something that we're hearing about Ukrainian intelligence predicting a battle for electricity in the near future, heading into winter. What can you tell us about what exactly that means?
Actually, as we discussed previously already, that Ukraine is getting ready for this, for winter and for this upcoming heating season. And in his recent big interview to the Ukrainian, one of the Ukrainian media outlets, Kirill Budanov, who is the head of Ukrainian intelligence, basically said that this upcoming winter, Ukraine will again face a battle for electricity, as this is a quote, as he called it. And he mentioned that, according again to him, Russian forces had certain success in accumulating additional missiles and additional equipment to basically implement these attacks and to target Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. So Ukrainian energy system and energy industry will be the main target, according to his latest updates.
We always appreciate your insights. Thank you so much. Anna Chernakova reporting for VOA from Kyiv.
Thank you.
Russia has remained largely silent on the outbreak of hostilities between Israeli forces and Hamas, but the Kremlin this week gave signs that it's weighing its role and its relationships with Israel, Hamas, and Iran. Without giving a date, Russian officials have announced an upcoming visit by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Luis Ramirez narrates this report from the VOA Moscow Bureau.
Just 2 days after Hamas militants launched their attacks on Israel, the Secretary General of the Arab League was received in Moscow by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who repeated Russia's prescription for lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Инициатива может быть только одна. Решение.
Lavrov said there can only be one initiative, and that is a decision to settle the Palestinian issue, one which was adopted by the United Nations. He said that implies the peaceful coexistence of two states as good neighbors. Those states, he said, are Israel and Palestine. Russia has for a long time sought to strike a delicate balance in its relationships with Israel and with battling Palestinian leaders in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That includes leaders of Iran-backed Hamas, whom the Russian foreign minister hosted in Moscow in September 2022, with full knowledge that it would strain relations with the Israelis. In breaking Russia's silence on the latest outbreak of fighting between Israel and Hamas, President Vladimir Putin did not miss the opportunity to blame Washington for the current bloodshed. Putin called it a clear example of the failure of U.S. policy in the Middle East. He accused Washington of trying to monopolize the solution, but said the U.S. was, in the Russian leader's words, unconcerned with finding compromises acceptable to both sides. U.S. officials on Wednesday had yet to comment on Putin's remarks. Beyond criticizing the U.S., observers say Russia is looking for opportunities to boost its influence in the Middle East. Galip Dalai is a consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House.
Russia has much more established links with Israel. I mean, let's not forget the nature of Israel's stance on Ukraine war that has also generated kind of much criticism in the West. On the other hand, Russia does have long-standing access and relationship with Hamas as well, but I think this is more of an engagement of convenience rather than an engagement of partnership.
But it is Iran, a big supporter of Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and one of Moscow's priority partners, that is the most problematic factor for the Kremlin. That is the opinion of Russian political scientist Arkady Dubnov, who says he believes Russia's involvement means the conflict in the Middle East threatens to escalate into a third world war with what he says would be innumerable consequences. In such a situation, Dubnov says he is certain Moscow would not take such a risk. Iran, he says, would. That, he said, is one of the scenarios to consider if Hezbollah, as Iran's proxy, gets involved by launching an offensive in northern Israel. With Moscow bogged down in its invasion of Ukraine, the new hostilities in the Middle East bring new questions not only for the Kremlin, but for global peace prospects. For the VOA Moscow Bureau, Luis Ramirez, VOA News.
With the recent massacre in Israel, some generations of Ukrainian Jews who call Israel home are reliving the trauma of war for a third time in their lifetimes. I talked about it with Adrian Karatnitsky, co-director of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. Thank you for being with us. Do you have any idea how many Ukrainian Jews are actually currently living in Israel?
It would be in the hundreds of thousands. The question is, of what generation are they? Because those who came before the fall of the Soviet Union and early after the fall of the Soviet Union would be primarily considered, it would be Russian-speaking and would have basically been filled with the colonial imperial narrative that existed during the Soviet period and predated by the Russian Empire. And only in the last 30 years, have Ukrainians rebuilt their own narrative and revived very extensive use of universal education in Ukrainian and so on. So the first generations and waves of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants who came to Israel and are a very important part of that society, they mainly came from, or most of them came from Ukraine, but they did not come with, I would say, a Ukrainian consciousness. There is an identification and ties with their cities and with their regions, but I don't think they had a distinctive Ukrainian identity. But then tens of thousands of Ukrainians have come since then, since the proclamation of Ukrainian independence, and those generations come with a different consciousness, a much more, I would say, Ukrainian Jewish identity, which is, I think, now a part of the fabric of Israeli life. That said, I think in general, the Israeli public has been, polls have indicated very substantial sympathy for the Ukrainian people who have been under attack. So in general, I would say there is a strong Ukrainian presence, but there's also a Ukrainian Jewish presence, but there's also a strong Ukrainian presence. There are also tens of thousands of people who've come for economic reasons, through reasons of intermarriage. And then there's a whole category of people who are, I would say, they're not quite bi-coastal, but they're bi-national, meaning they have businesses or they maintain apartments in Ukraine while also primarily living and having taken Israeli citizenship. So there was before the war, very extensive commerce. There were 4 or 5 flights daily from Kiev, for example, and also less frequent flights from Odessa, but just that showed a very, very active commerce. And of course, we know very many Haredi Jews, Hasidic Jews, make pilgrimages to what they refer to as their holy lands, the holy lands of the creation of Hasidism, and they are all predominantly on Ukrainian territory where Hasidism initially arose. And of course, Uman, a pilgrimage where even at wartime, nearly 30,000 Hasidic Jews came to Uman this September to take part in, religious observances and to make their annual pilgrimages there.
And I'm sure that those that are living there or frequently part-time living there have to be somewhat re-traumatized given the war that's happening through Russia's invasion of Ukraine and now what's happening in Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I can even say that there is a sort of a triangulation between the United States, Ukraine, and Israel. I know of some friends from Brooklyn who were in Ashkelon visiting friends who are of Ukrainian Jewish ancestry and were there visiting friends and more distant family. When the attacks happened, they fled immediately quickly from the area, leaving behind their passports. So they still have haven't gone back to pick them up. But yes, it's there's even another form of double trauma there, or even triple trauma, and that is there have been Holocaust survivors, elderly Holocaust survivors, especially in places like Odessa and Kiev, where there are larger Dnipro, 3 cities with very large Jewish populations in Ukraine that have been subjected to bombings on a regular, systematic basis. And these are people who were children. There is a group of them that were children of the Holocaust. Some have evacuated to Israel, and now there is yet another trauma that they face. So 3 horrible instances of attacks on civilian life, 3 instances where you feel that your life is at issue and potentially threatened.
Adrian Karatnitsky, co-director of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, we appreciate your time. The United States announced Wednesday it's providing Ukraine with up to $200 million in a new military aid package as the Biden administration tries to temper concerns that the growing needs from Ukraine and now Israel could spread the U.S. too thin. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has details.
The U.S. will support both Ukraine and Israel as they fight to protect their homelands, one against Russian invaders, the other against Hamas militants. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
Absolutely, we can do both, and we will do both. We're going to do what's necessary to help our allies and partners, and we're going to also do what's necessary to make sure that we maintain the capability to protect our interests and defend our country.
As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Brussels, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin listed more than $1 billion in new support from member nations, including another Patriot air defense system and 10 more Leopard 2 tanks from Germany. Austin also said the U.S. would help lead the coalition that is working to provide Ukraine with F-16s.
This will take months, as we've said before, so earliest is next spring when we can begin to see an initial capability.
Wednesday marked the first Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting since the U.S. Congress omitted new aid for Ukraine from a stopgap spending bill passed last month to prevent a government shutdown.
There is still bipartisan support for Ukraine. And of course, democracies will take their time to work things out.
The U.S. also announced an aid package that would provide Ukraine with up to $200 million in more weapons from American military stockpiles. General C.Q. Brown Jr. is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
I realize during the winter months, it gets more challenging, but Ukraine has intent to continue their offensive operations throughout the winter months. And I do believe, based on what I heard today from each of the nations, we're doing all the right things to posture them to be successful.
The U.S. package includes more ammunition for HIMARS artillery systems and more TOW missiles to counter Russian tanks. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
And for analysis on the growing concerns over future aid for Ukraine, I spoke with Doug Kleen, policy analyst for Razum Ukraine in Washington, D.C.
There is a lot of consternation about what is going to happen with Ukraine. We've been supporting them since Russia's invasion. What do you think is going to happen and what we're going to see here with funding for Ukraine?
I think that one thing that's important to keep in mind for the context around U.S. support for Ukraine is that by and large, polls show the American people are inclined to support Ukraine, but they are persuadable. Whoever is trying to persuade them and make the argument to the American people about whether or not they should support Ukraine, that can have a really big impact. And so with that context, I think that unfortunately Ukraine's friends in Washington, they've gotten a little complacent and didn't realize just how politicized aid to Ukraine is becoming. It is getting increasingly more political and less bipartisan, certainly from how it was just after Russia's illegal invasion last year. And so that gap is starting to widen. And as the 2024 election heats up, it's only going to get wider, and it's going to get more politically toxic, I think, for Republicans who are being pulled, really, and having this internal political fight with the more quasi-isolationist wing of the Republican Party, the MAGA people. And so at this moment, I do think that there remains strong consensus. More aid to Ukraine is going to pass through Congress. The White House is going to make sure it happens. Democrats and the Senate and more moderate Republicans are going to make sure it happens. But it could be a bigger fight. I think that that's one of the reasons why there's more energy for a big package of Ukraine aid that will last through the election next year.
A big package meaning combined with Israel or separately?
Potentially combined with Israel. That's something that, since there is clearly an immediate need to help both Ukraine and both Israel at the moment, I think that there probably is quite a bit of energy to combine these. Unfortunately, Congress is so dysfunctional that adding in multiple votes on different things can make it more difficult to get anything done. By packaging them together, it might be more likely that all these priorities are taken care of. But when I say a major package, I mean a significant package of supplemental assistance for Ukraine. The White House originally requested for about $24 billion to help Ukraine. That would have lasted through the end of this year, and then they would have had to vote on additional aid going into 2024. With how increasingly politicized and difficult helping Ukraine is becoming, there is significant interest in the White House and on Capitol Hill to instead do not a $24 billion package, but maybe closer to a $100 billion package. That will guarantee assistance to Ukraine all the way through the 2024 election so that this doesn't keep ending up being a political football through the election.
So with Israel in the equation, do you think that makes it even more difficult?
I think that at this moment, these twin national security crises of the need to help Israel, to help an ally, and the need to help Ukraine as it's going into the winter and trying to make some more progress in its still, somewhat successful counteroffensive. I think that the fact that both of these crises are happening at once, it will make it more likely that aid for both happens, that it is able to get through Congress. At the same time, these are new pressures that the administration and Congress are having to deal with. We've got limited supplies of ammunition and artillery shells and whatnot. Israel and Ukraine need very different kinds of weapons. So, it's not splitting the same thing between them both. But the U.S. is reckoning, I think, with being woefully unprepared for these kinds of major conflicts to happen in the world and for us to have to meet obligations and responsibilities over it. So that's going to be a pretty significant challenge that the U.S. just has to deal with. They have to ramp up production and make sure they can respond to crises like this in the future and make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to win.
Doug Klain, policy analyst for Razom Ukraine in Washington, D.C. You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Russia's president has arrived in Kyrgyzstan on a rare trip abroad. We hear more from Associated Press correspondent Karen Shamus.
President Vladimir Putin stood on a podium alongside his Kyrgyz counterpart, President Sadir Japarov, as a military band welcomed the Russian leader. It's the first time this year that Putin has travelled outside of Russia and Russian-held territories of Ukraine. Putin was indicted earlier this year by the International Criminal Court for war crimes in Ukraine. He came to attend the Commonwealth of Independent States Summit, which Kyrgyzstan is hosting. Leaders of Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan will also attend the summit. I'm Karen Shamas.
Farmers say the harvest season that is just ending in Ukraine was a good one, but they face another year of falling profits due to the skyrocketing costs of getting their products to international markets during wartime. Lisha Bakalets reports from the Kyiv region.
When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, operating a combined harvester became a dangerous profession for Roman Vitsko. He says the fields he worked on get shelled. One time, Vitsko says there were explosions on both sides of the field he was working in, and parts of the rockets were sticking out of the ground, so he had to go around them. Roman Vitsko harvests sunflowers for Makariv Agrobud, an agricultural company in the Kyiv region. The company's land was occupied for a month at the start of Russia's assault on Ukraine. Микола Горовий is the chief agronomist at the company.
Офісне приміщення, складське приміщення.
He says the Russians destroyed an office building and warehouses. He said the company still cannot use 50 hectares of its land for fear that it could be mined. Горовий says it hasn't been checked yet. The company lost several $1 million, says its director, Sergei Valinovich. He says conditions are better this year, but revenue forecasts are still disappointing.
При цінах, які існують на сьогодні.
Will the company have any profits? Valinovich asks. He says it's not even a question anymore. He says it will be lucky if it even breaks this season. The main factor is the rising cost of logistics. Denis Marchuk, deputy chair of the Ukrainian Agrarian Council, explains.
На зовнішніх ринках ми розуміємо, що попит на українську продукцію є.
He says Ukrainian farmers have foreign markets to export their products, and the demand is also high. But he says there is question of how to take those products out of the country. The main road for Ukraine's agricultural exports is the Black Sea. Since the beginning of the war, that corridor has been almost inactive. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, an agreement between the UN, Turkey and Ukraine, as well as Russia, to ensure the safe export of Ukrainian agricultural products, expired in July. Using alternate roads means added expenses.
Є тільки два ключових моменти з експортом – це річкові порти.
Marchuk says there are two options left. He says the first one is using the river ports on the Danube that he says Russian forces are constantly shelling. He says using the river ports means farm exporters must now charter more vessels. And he says now they must also use roads and railways to route their products through European Union countries. Ukraine is working with its Western partners to develop a humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea from Odessa through Bulgaria and Romania, and some ships have already used it. The project raises hope that Ukrainian farmers will see better profits. Lesia Bakalets, VOA News, Kyiv.
And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage on Ukraine and news from around the world 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, we thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA's Lori London.
This is the voice of America. Washington, D.C.
Today, heavy fighting in Israel and Gaza continues.
Blinken said he plans to meet with leaders in the region to try to prevent spreading of violence that has claimed at least 2,800 lives on both sides.
Plus, we visit a village on Israel's northern border.
Hezbollah is just a few kilometers from here.
And their military outposts can be seen from the Israeli side of the border. One local worker tells us he sometimes can also see fighters across the fence.
And later, a close look at upcoming elections in Poland. Today is Friday, October 13th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. Syria is accusing Israel of trying to widen the conflict by bombing Damascus and Aleppo. We'll get the latest in a moment. We begin today, though, with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He was in Israel on Thursday to hold meetings with senior Israeli officials in response to the crisis triggered by Saturday's brutal attacks by Hamas. Blinken says that he plans to show solidarity with Israel, but will also seek to prevent the conflict from spilling over into the greater Middle East. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has the story.
Israelis have begun to bury the dead, including this man who was killed during the fighting at the Be'eri kibbutz in southern Israel. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spent the day in Israel meeting with top officials, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Israelis grieving the loss of their loved ones. Blinken said he arrived in the country not just as a U.S. diplomat, but also as a Jew, father, and husband. In this moment where he said the suffering is hard to fathom.
The message that I bring to Israel is this. You may be strong enough on your own to defend yourself, but as long as America exists, you will never ever have to. We will always be there by your side.
Blinken said he plans to meet with leaders in the region to try to prevent spreading of violence that has claimed at least 2,800 lives on both sides, and to try to win the release of some 150 hostages Hamas is still holding.
From here, I'll go on to Jordan, where I'll meet with His Majesty King Abdullah and with Palestinian Authority President Abbas. And then over the coming days, we'll visit with leaders in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Qatar.
As Israel continued to pound Gaza City with airstrikes, Blinken said he and Israeli leaders discussed ways to address the humanitarian needs of Gaza residents. Blinken said he also planned to bring up the possibilities for safe passage of civilians out of Gaza during meetings with regional leaders in the coming days. Israel is gathering massive forces, tanks, and other heavy armor around the occupied Palestinian territory as it continues its retaliatory campaign against what Prime Minister Netanyahu called the sheer evil of terror attacks by Hamas. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
As mentioned, Secretary Blinken is trying to prevent the conflict from widening. He's got his work cut out for him. Syria has accused Israel of carrying out missile strikes on airports in Damascus and Aleppo on Thursday. News of the strikes come as there are growing fears that the conflict between Israel and Hamas could spiral into a regional war. Henry Ridgewell has the story.
Israel has mobilized up to 360,000 reservists following the attack by Hamas militants. Hundreds of tanks have been positioned at the border with the Gaza Strip. A ground invasion appears imminent. Iran is a major supporter of Hamas, and there are fears that the attack could spiral into a broader conflict in the region. Barbara Slavin is from the Stimson Center in Washington.
If Israel is going to mount a ground invasion of Gaza, I think there is real concern that these other groups that have gotten Iranian support and that share Iran's goals and share Iran's animosity toward Israel, that they might get involved as well.
That includes Hezbollah, a powerful militant group based in Lebanon and backed by Iran. Israeli forces have exchanged sporadic rocket fire with Hezbollah fighters in recent days. Syria said Thursday that Israeli missiles had targeted airports in Damascus and Aleppo, damaging their runways. Israel did not comment, but has previously accused Syria of facilitating arms shipments from Iran to militant groups in the region. In the wake of the Hamas attack, Israeli politicians, riven by bitter internal divisions, have formed a unity government. That may give pause to the country's foes, says former U.S. Middle East envoy Dennis Ross.
I don't rule out the possibility there'll be an all-out war, although Hezbollah was counting on divisions in Israel, and I think they've seen what they were thinking about Israel in terms of divisions is no longer the case. So that may also temper their interest in all-out war. And as I said, Iran may have an interest in keeping Hezbollah in reserve in the event that they think they may be attacked.
Israel could seek to expand its strikes against Iran's allies and proxies beyond Gaza. Benam Ben Taleblu is from the Federation for Defense of Democracies in Washington.
There's always the potential for Israel to strike elsewhere, of course, not just Lebanon, which would invoke a third Lebanon war, but potentially the widening of what is already underway between Israel and Iran indirectly, which is the war between the wars, the cyber element, the maritime element.
But Israel is unlikely to attack Iran directly, says analyst Lina Khatib.
Because this would already stretch
resources that this war have shown to be stretched in Israel at the level of intelligence, for example.
Meanwhile, the United States has sent an aircraft carrier fleet to the region. President Joe Biden said it was a warning to Iran that they should, in his words, be careful. Henry Ridgewell, VOA News, London.
And here are some other stories we're following from around the world. Afghanistan's Taliban has blocked earthquake-related relief assistance from Pakistan because of a social media post by Pakistan's prime minister. The post implied that Afghanistan had asked for assistance after the deadly earthquake, while Afghan officials maintain they made no such requests. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell arrived in China on Thursday. He's looking to manage the EU's strategy with its largest trading partner while laying the foundation for a planned summit later this year. On Wednesday, a Swedish court fined climate activist Greta Thunberg once again for disobeying police during an environmental protest. The Malmö District Court ordered her to pay a fine amounting to just over $200. And singer Rudolph Isley, one of the founding members of the influential R&B group the Isley Brothers, died at his home in Chicago. The Isleys were responsible for many hits, but perhaps their most enduring was 1959's Shout. Isley was 84.
You know you make me wanna shout, kick my heels up and shout, throw my hands up and shout, throw my head back and shout, come on now, don't forget to say.
This is Science in a Minute.
A rare astronomical event called an annular solar eclipse will be taking place on Saturday, October 14th. This event is also being called the Ring of Fire eclipse. A Ring of Fire eclipse takes place when the moon appears slightly smaller than it does during a normal eclipse when it passes in front of the sun. This will make the sun look like a ring of fire in the sky when in totality. The moon will look smaller than usual because it is at its farthest orbital point from Earth, or apogee. People in parts of the western United States, Central and South America are expected to lie within the path of a total eclipse, while those who are just outside of this trajectory will witness a partial eclipse. NASA says a full or at least partial eclipse will be visible throughout the continental United States. Rick Pantaleo, VOA News.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. Still to come, Russian President Vladimir Putin is traveling. We'll find out where to and why in just a moment. But up first, Polish voters face a choice in parliamentary elections set for October 15th. They're likely to have a significant impact not only on a deeply polarized Polish society, but also on the future of Europe as a whole. For more insight, Kim Lewis speaks with VOA's Miroslava Gangadze. She's in Warsaw, Poland, covering the elections.
So it appears this is going to be a close race between the ruling right-wing Law and Justice Party and the opposition Civic Coalition for seats in the two-house, 460-member parliament. Is this a surprise?
It is indeed a very close race. The Civic Coalition trails the Law and Order and Justice Party by just several percentage points in the polls. The Law and Justice Party came to power in 2015, and they are governing Poland for 8 years. So it is very logical that a big part of the population is looking for change. The opposition is trying to galvanize its voters to come and vote to change the government, and the Civic Coalition bloc, headed by Donald Tusk, he's 66 and former president of the European Council and the former Polish prime minister. He pledged to revise the judiciary's amendment that Law and Justice Party proposed. He promised safeguard media independence and protect civil liberties. The Tusk coalition assert that it will work to restore Poland's international reputation as a democratic nation and rebuild its cooperative relationship with the EU, particularly with Germany, which has faced strong criticism from the current government in the recent months. At the same time, Law and Justice Party are claiming that they fulfill their promises and are ready to govern one more term. That would be a very unique political situation to govern for 3 terms.
Looking at the people, what do the people of Poland want?
People of Poland are concerned about their security and well-being, but they are very divided. There is 10 million pensioners in Poland. It's a quarter of the population. So they just want to maintain their pensions and have free healthcare as Poland has. For the younger generation, these elections are about civil liberties and free choices that they would like to make. These elections will be critical for the direction of Poland as a democratic state and basically direction of Europe as a whole.
The political force that comes out as the winner, what will they have to do regarding the support of Ukraine?
According to analysts I have talked to, Civic Platform can score, we talked about possible coalition, right? So the Civic Platform can score enough votes to form a parliamentary majority in partnership with other forces like Poland's New Left. Alternatively, Law and Justice most likely will form the coalition with far-right Confederation Party. Initially, due to the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression, there was a rare moment of national unity in Poland with widespread agreement on supporting Ukraine and against the Russian aggression. However, consensus has eroded during this election campaign. The Law and Justice Party, as analysts say, is adjusting its rhetoric, particularly in terms of Ukraine, to feed off competition from the far-right Confederation, who are perceived as pro-Russian. Additionally, there is a crisis in agricultural imports, especially grain delivery in rural areas, which is influencing the ruling party messaging. The member of the current government and special envoy for Ukraine, Jadwiga Emilevich, told me in recent interview that at the start of the war, 38 million Poles were standing face to face with Ukrainians and helping them and opening their homes. And today, she said, it does not matter whether Poles will vote for Law and Justice or Civic Platform. They feel a bit disappointed and even offended sometimes, being treated, as she points, not very seriously by their Kyiv partner. During this election campaign, the support for Ukraine dropped 10%, but still, majority of Poles believe that they have to support Ukraine. And irrespective of the election outcome, as observers say, both political forces share a consensus on the necessity of providing continued support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression.
That's VOA's Eastern Europe Bureau Chief Miroslava Gongadze. She's speaking with my colleague Kim Lewis. U.S. President Joe Biden is facing several challenges in his 2024 re-election bid, and one of them is rather surprising for a Democrat. We'll find out what that is coming up in a little bit. Now, though, we look to Central Asia, where Russia's president has arrived in Kyrgyzstan on a rare trip abroad. AP correspondent Karen Chamas reports.
President Vladimir Putin stood on a podium alongside his Kyrgyz counterpart, President Sadir Japarov, as a military band welcomed the Russian leader. It's the first time this year that Putin has travelled outside of Russia and Russian-held territories of Ukraine. Putin was indicted earlier this year by the International Criminal Court for war crimes in Ukraine. He came to attend the Commonwealth of Independent States Summit, which Kyrgyzstan is hosting. Leaders of Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan will also attend the summit. I'm Karen Chamas.
Hollywood writers have ended their strike and many have returned to work. However, talks between Hollywood studios and the SAG-AFTRA Actors Union aren't going as well. Reuters' Olivia Zolino has more.
Negotiations between the SAG-AFTRA Actors Union and Hollywood studios broke down on Wednesday. The two sides clashed over streaming revenue, the use of artificial intelligence, and other issues. The 3-month work stoppage, which has put most U.S.-based film and television productions on hold, has cost the California economy billions and left thousands of crew members out of work. The union resumed negotiations with studios last week after the Writers Guild of America ended its work stoppage. But the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, or AMPTP, said talks were suspended once it reviewed the most recent union proposal. In a statement, the group, which represents Netflix, Walt Disney, and other media companies, said, quote, "It is clear that the gap between the AMPTP and SAG-AFTRA is too great, and conversations are no longer moving us in a productive direction." In a letter to members issued early Thursday, SAG-AFTRA said it had negotiated in good faith with studios, quote, "despite the fact that last week they presented an offer that was shockingly worth less than they proposed before the strike began." One issue of contention is SAG-AFTRA's demand for a share of streaming revenue to be delivered as a bonus to cast members. The AMPTP put the proposal at a cost of $800 billion, a figure SAG-AFTRA says is overstated by 60%. The union also said studios, quote, refused to protect performers from being replaced by AI. The AMPTP said it had promised to obtain actors' consent before using any digital replicas of their likenesses.
That's Reuters' Olivia Zolino reporting for us. And finally today, recent polls are showing softening support for President Joe Biden in his 2024 re-election bid among Black and Hispanic voters. While analysts stress that the shifts aren't extreme, in a close election they could be pivotal. And the Biden campaign tells VOA that it's not taking any votes for granted. Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the story.
When Democratic President Joe Biden was elected in November 2020, he had the support of more than 70% of non-white voters, the New York Times reported. But that support appears to be waning. A Times analysis shows Biden leading Trump by just 53% to 28% among the same voting group as of early September. The analysis is based on an aggregation of New York Times Siena College polls from 2022 and 2023, according to the Times. The daughter of Peruvian immigrants, Madeleine Bushi, favors Biden's re-election in 2024, but isn't surprised that some Hispanics are leaning toward voting Republican next year.
You know, Latinos are a little conservative. Like, if you hear in the news, everyone's talking abortion, LGBTQ plus rights. And, to our fault, our community is a little, conservative about that. So I think Republicans they're doing a good job getting to them.
Analysts acknowledge the shift in voting patterns to the right is real, but with a word of caution. Omar Wasso is a political scientist at the University of California, Berkeley.
We're seeing some working class Hispanics and African Americans who are more conservative sorting into the Republican Party. And that reflects this kind of ideological sorting that's been happening over decades.
Zoltan Heinel is a professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego.
We certainly haven't seen enough years of that shift to know, where it's going in the future or whether it will persist.
Historically, about 90% of the black vote has consistently gone to the Democrats. But some black voters told VOA they are undecided about 2024. Lonnie Persley is concerned about the economy.
Inflation is crazy right now, but we're not seeing a monumental increase in wages.
Denise Williams says there are unresolved social and economic inequities.
Health-wise, money-wise, it's not on, the same scale as, ones who are not of a minority group.
The Biden campaign maintains that the president's agenda is popular among blacks and Hispanics, and that efforts to communicate the administration's achievements to those communities in particular are in full swing. Spokesperson for the Biden campaign, Kevin Munoz.
We're not focused on every poll. We're focused on putting in the work to reach
every community that's going to be decisive in this election. We know we can't take the Black or Latino vote for granted, and that's why we're putting historic investments early in on this campaign to reach every voter.
It's a $25 million communication effort, and it includes a series of digital, TV, and radio ads that since August have been targeting Hispanic and African American voters on battleground states. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Arlington, Virginia.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for listening. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
October 16th is World Food Day, an observance meant to raise awareness of global hunger and malnutrition and to bring forth new ideas for boosting food security. It's a tall order. According to the UN's World Food Program, the world is experiencing the largest food crisis in modern history. Something about this global food crisis is different, said Dr. Carrie Fowler, the State Department's Special Envoy for Global Food Security. The number of food insecure people are greater. The crises seem to be more frequent, so we need some game-changing developments in agriculture and food security.
Food security fundamentally depends on fertile soils and adapted crops. Degraded soils and unadapted crops are never going to provide for food security.
That is why the United States, in partnership with the African Union and the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, announced the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, or VACS. VACS aims to foster more resilient food systems by developing climate-resilient, nutritious crop varieties and building healthy, fertile soils, said Dr. Fowler. Initially, we're focusing back on Africa.
On soils, we seek to help African governments and farmers answer 4 fundamental questions, all of which require data and analysis that my government and our farmers here have, and which are mostly lacking in Africa.
The first question is where to plant. The answer to that question will help governments to promote effective land use planning, said Dr. Fowler. Second question, what to plant, will help farmers and governments make good decisions to maximize productivity, resilience, and nutrition.
Third question, what management system to employ? That's where we have to integrate everything we know about the environment, the soils, the crop varieties, to help farmers make informed decisions. And the fourth question, how do we apply all of that in a given year, in a given season? That's where we hope to expand the access to hyperlocal, timely recommendations to help farmers make the kind of management decisions in real time that they need to better manage their inputs, such as fertilizer.
Africa is a continent where precision agriculture is more needed than anywhere else in the world. The farmers need that kind of detailed scientific knowledge about their soils that good management, sustainable practices, and productive agriculture require, said Dr. Fowler. We need to think boldly. We need to act boldly. We need some game-changing developments in agriculture and food security. VACS may be that development.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
The international community turns its focus to Israel's war with Hamas. Russia is pounding Ukraine with ground and air assaults.
The most massive offensive actions since the beginning of full-scale invasion.
Plus, could Russia have sent Hamas Western weapons it captured in Ukraine?
The weapons that have been captured to date, by my sources, are that is the case. And that's but not only my sources from the Middle East, but also from a U.S. government.
And later in the program, why the International Olympic Committee just suspended Russia. Today is Friday, October 13th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. evening. I'm Lori London in Washington. While the world turns its attention to Israel's war against Hamas, Russia has been launching some of its fiercest onslaughts of air and ground assaults since its invasion in February of 2022. I got an update from Anna Chernikova in Kyiv.
So, Anna, a fourth day of intense fighting in this biggest offensive by Russian forces we've seen in months. They are pummeling the East Ukrainian town of Avdiivka. What's the latest that you're hearing?
Well, yes, actually, it's the fourth day in a row that the city of Avdiivka in the Donetsk region is getting this super intense attack, super intense shelling. Avdiivka is famous for its location, of course. A lot of people here in Ukraine call it kind of a gate to the city of Donetsk. And if you look at the location, it's understandable. So a lot of experts, and especially military experts and people who understand military well, also saying that Avdiivka has quite a strategic meaning both for Ukrainian and Russian forces. It is under Ukrainian control, and Russian forces are kind of trying to, first of all, shell it and destroy the logistics, but at the same time, it looks like the Russian forces are trying to get through and to move forward and get control of Avdiivka. However, the latest what we're hearing from the local military administration representative, there are reports that situation is very tough, but Ukrainian forces remaining in the area and Ukrainian forces keep control. The head of the Avdiivka city military administration, Vitaly Barabash, reported that actually this shelling, which is happening right now, in his opinion, is the most massive offensive actions since the beginning of full-scale invasion. Also, what we understand from the recent updates from that area is that Russian forces are getting a lot of equipment in there and manpower in there, and also the attack is happening not only on the city of Avdiivka, but also in the surrounding area of 20 to 30 kilometers. President Zelensky also mentioned this situation in one of his latest speeches, and he said that Ukrainian forces are holding their positions in Avdiivka and that this is an extremely important area at the front line at this point, and Ukrainians will protect it and will not let Russian forces in. So this is what the latest we have from there.
And what are you hearing about the reports that Ukraine struck a Russian missile carrier and a patrol ship in separate attacks this week involving seaborne drones carrying experimental weapons?
We are hearing this information. Again, I will just point out that we do not have any independently confirmed information or any official comments on that. However, we're hearing reports both in the Ukrainian media and also in the international media, and from basically it's coming from Ukrainian security service and Ukrainian intelligence that reportedly Ukrainians' latest attacks on the Russian Navy was done with the use of the experimental weapons, which Ukraine is working on. Also, this information was getting public some time ago, but again, no one really confirmed it officially, of course. But what we're hearing that this experimental weapon is actually getting its way through and has certain success. Ukrainian sources also saying that this is just the beginning and that this weapon is at the developing process, so we might hear more on that.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is in Israel for meetings to discuss America's security assistance. At a joint news conference with his Israeli counterpart, Austin was asked about U.S. support for Ukraine.
And we remain fully able to project power and uphold our commitments and direct resources to multiple theaters. So we will stand with Israel even as we stand with Ukraine. The United States can walk and chew gum at the same time.
VOA Ukrainian service correspondent Irina Salamko spoke with Philip Carber, president of the Potomac Foundation and assistant professor at Georgetown University, about concerns that Israel's war is overshadowing Russia's intensifying attacks on Ukraine.
Obviously, any of the magnitude of the attacks in Israel, and given the very close American relationship and the large Israeli diaspora, Jewish diaspora in the United States. Those attacks have just an enormous significance, and they've removed Ukraine off the front page, which it was already sort of interest was declining, and put it to the back of the newspaper, if you will, if it's even covered on a daily basis right now. So yes, it has an impact of stealing the coverage. I think, though, there are several other aspects of it that are interesting. There's also concern that given that one of the arguments against sending a lot more aid to Ukraine is that the U.S. stocks are running low, and the Israelis use American tank ammunition, American artillery ammunition, and aircraft bombs and parts and so forth for their Air Force, which is basically all American, that this is going to take up our valuable stocks and also available money, and thus there'll be an argument for less resources for Ukraine. I think that is something that is of concern, but I think it's a short-term phenomenon. And when I say short term, I mean right now while everybody's focused on Israel. I think the longer term significance of it actually has the potential of moving quite dramatically to the other side. For example, there are reports that are coming out that American weapons and European weapons have been used by Hamas, and that those came from Ukraine. And Russian intelligence and information agencies are promoting this as if Ukraine sold those. That isn't true. In fact, if one looks at the serial numbers of these, and the forensic evidence will come out, it's just important right now to stop that story before it becomes perceived reality, is that those were weaponry that were captured by the Russians in the early days of their invasion in 2022 when they overran a number of Ukrainian units. Well, the Russians don't have American ammunition, American type of weaponry that would be consistent, that could be used in the weapons that they captured. So it's very natural that other than exploiting them and taking them apart and trying to understand them, that they might want to supply them to a friendly group, which ostensibly takes their fingerprints off the weapons, and that group also can find ammunition elsewhere in the third world to be used.
A couple U.S. Congress people were mentioning this, saying, Hamas is using U.S. Western weapon, and of course Russia tried to sell it as like a black market and all the stuff. The messages they tried to impose, like in Security Council, discussing, like this Western like supplies of weapon to Ukraine. But Ukrainian intelligence service, they already said, as you said, that like the weapons that was captured by Russian, and then they just gave it to Hamas. According to your information, this is true. And you see, as you said, like using the serial numbers, you can really track this. Like,
it takes a while to track all the serial numbers. So if let's say a TOW anti-tank weapons launcher was captured by the Russians, they want to give it to the Hamas. When it's lost, eventually, because it was an American weapon, Ukraine needs to account for, and the serial number of TOW such and such was lost on the battlefield. It happens all the time. In every battle, some American weaponry is lost. The more we give, the more it gets lost. So that serial number, if reported lost, and it's easy enough to track, was that a battle? What the date that it occurred? Where did it occur? Did the Russians get control of the battlefield after the contact? As a detective project, it's relatively easy to determine the truth of that. It takes a while to do that for any and all weapons that would reportedly have been there. But the weapons that have been captured to date, by my sources, are that is the case. And that's but not only my sources from the Middle East, but also from the U.S. government. Yes, let's wait for the definitive answer after we've had weeks of forensic analysis and look at all of them. But let's also put a stop to that story, because it's utter Russian disinformation. Now, the reverse of that story is really powerful, because it shows who's on whose side. So Russia, along with, or obviously its ally Iran, have been arming Hamas. So it really challenges, there's a lot that in this incident that challenges Netanyahu's policy, a policy that by himself, admittedly, very cynically nationalistic oriented. And his argument was, yes, we identify with the slaughter. Yes, we think the Russians are bad, but we and the Russians have a deal over Syria, and we want to, and that's in the interest of Israel's survival. So that has to come above human rights, above siding with the deal, even though Israelis have been the first to always go mass murder, slaughter, shame. And he goes, no, this time it's cold. All of a sudden, his deal with Putin is looking a little thin, not only in terms of Russian stuff, but also in terms of Russia's relationship with Iran. Not to mention, everybody says this is intelligence failure. Well, the Egyptians are saying, no, we've been sending the Israelis messages that something big was happening for weeks now. Usually when you look back famous surprise attacks. Whether it was the 73 war, whether it was Pearl Harbor, famous surprise, the Russian direct invasion of Ukraine in February of 22. The evidence of buildup was all there. It was the politicians who decided not to recognize it for whatever reason. So I suspect when we find the truth of that, it's not going to look well on Netanyahu government, not to mention his controversial policies with respect to the military that have been causing riots in Tel Aviv. So at the absolute worst time when you really need a united military and a united country. I won't predict what's going to happen to Netanyahu. I think at a minimum, his attitude towards Ukraine and Russia is likely to change significantly. Russian Empire. Guess what that includes? It includes Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, half of eastern Poland, Ukraine, on and on and on. The first 5 of those I just mentioned are NATO members. So when Putin comes to them, guess what? Uncle Sam is going to be up to it to our neck, if not over our head. Some people say, oh, well, we got to worry about China. Who is Russia's strategic ally? Who's financially undergirding the Russian invasion of Ukraine? China. Who's Iran's big exporter? China. So when you put this puzzle together, it becomes increasingly obscene for people to sit there and have their eyes closed and pretend that this is about saving a little bit of money or worrying about domestic problems. And so I think what's going to happen, there is going to be, as a result of this, if for no other reason than because of the attitude towards Israel and the Jewish diaspora in the United States, you're going to have, instead of having this increasing bifurcation of American politics to the extremes, I think you're going to see on coming back together a joint effort for a bipartisan American foreign policy. A foreign policy that is focused on realistically addressing who are the bad guys, who are our friends, and what do we need to do about it.
That was Philip Carber, president of the Pacific Foundation and assistant professor at Georgetown University, speaking with my colleague, VOA Ukrainian service correspondent Irina Salamko. Polish voters face a stark choice in parliamentary elections set for this Sunday, October 15th, which are likely to have a significant impact not only on deeply polarized Polish society, but also on the future of Ukraine and Europe as a whole. My colleague Kim Lewis spoke with VOA's Eastern Bureau Chief Miroslava Gongadze in Warsaw for insights on how the results could affect its neighbors in what is becoming a very tight race.
It is indeed a very close race. The Civic Coalition trails the Law and Order and Justice Party by just several percentage points in the polls. The Law and Justice Party came to power in 2015, and they are governing Poland for 8 years. So it is very logical that a big part of the population is looking for change. The opposition is trying to galvanize its voters to come and vote to change the government, and the Civic Coalition bloc, headed by Donald Tusk, he's 66 and former president of the European Council and the former Polish prime minister, he pledged to revise the judiciary's amendment that Law and Justice Party proposed. He promised safeguard media independence and protect civil liberties. The Tusk coalition assert that it will work to restore Poland's international reputation as a democratic nation and rebuild its cooperative relationship with the EU, particularly with Germany, which has faced strong criticism from the current government in the recent months. At the same time, Law and Justice Party are claiming that they fulfill their promises and are ready to govern one more term. That would be a very unique political situation to govern for 3 terms. From behind the scene by former Prime Minister Jarosław Kaczynski, he's 74 now, the party pledged to maintain traditional values and ensure the country's security, especially in the light of Russian aggression in neighboring Ukraine. The analysts say that most likely none of the political forces will be able to win outright, and they will have to form the coalition with smaller parties if they will enter the parliament.
What do the people of Poland want?
People of Poland concern about their security and well-being, but they are very divided. There is 10 million pensioners in Poland. It's a quarter of the population. So they just want to maintain their pensions and have free healthcare as Poland has. For the younger generation, these elections are about civil liberties and free choices that they would like to make. These elections will be critical for the direction of Poland as a democratic state and basically direction of Europe as a whole.
The political force that comes out as the winner, what will they have to do regarding the support of Ukraine?
According to analysts I have talked to, Civic Platform can score, we talked about possible coalition, right? So the Civic Platform can score enough votes to form a parliamentary majority in partnership with other forces like Poland's New Left. Alternatively, Law and Justice most likely will form the coalition with far-right Confederation Party. Initially, due to the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression, there was a rare moment of national unity in Poland with widespread agreement on supporting Ukraine and against the Russian aggression. However, consensus has eroded during this election campaign. The Law and Justice Party, as analysts say, is adjusting its rhetoric, particularly in terms of Ukraine, to feed off competition from the far-right Confederation, who are perceived as pro-Russian. Additionally, there is a crisis in agricultural imports, especially grain delivery in rural areas, which is influencing the ruling party messaging. The member of the current government and special envoy for Ukraine, Jadwiga Emilevich, told me in recent interview that at the start of the war, 38 million Poles were standing face to face with Ukrainians and helping them and opening their homes. And today, she said, it does not matter whether Poles will vote for Law and Justice or Civic Platform. They feel a bit disappointed and even offended sometimes, being treated, as she points, not very seriously by their Kyiv partner. During this election campaign, the support for Ukraine dropped 10%, but still, majority of Poles believe that they have to support Ukraine. And irrespective of the election outcome, as observers say, both political forces share a consensus on the necessity of providing continued support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression.
VOA Eastern Bureau Chief Miroslava Gongadze in Warsaw, speaking with my colleague Kim Lewis. You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Russian authorities have raided the homes of lawyers representing imprisoned opposition leader Alexei Navalny, Associated Press correspondent Karen Shamus reports.
The raids are part of a criminal case in which the three men are accused of participating in an extremist group, according to Navalny's ally Ivan Zhdanov. Navalny's team confirmed on Telegram that all three of his lawyers were detained after the search, apparently as suspects in the case. Navalny's chief of staff said the case against the lawyers comes as Navalny is due to be transferred to a penal colony. He added it was unclear exactly where that would be. Navalny has been behind bars since January 2021, serving a 19-year prison sentence. I'm Karen Shamas.
Officials say that 90% of the missiles fired into Israel by Hamas were thwarted by its missile defense system called the Iron Dome. VOA's Rick Pantaleo spoke with missile defense expert Professor Dinshaw Mistry at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio to learn more about Israel's Iron Dome and how it could potentially be a useful tool for Ukraine's offensive against Russian attacks.
So the Iron Dome is one layer of a multi-layer missile defense system, and it is the layer designed for the shortest range incoming rocket, a range of about 2 to 40 miles. And then there are other layers of missile defense, such as the David Sling and the Arrow, that defend against rockets coming in from greater ranges. So that's the short definition of the system.
And what does it do? I understand that it has intercepted 90% of projectiles fired toward Israel since it was attacked by surprise by Hamas.
That is right. It has a fairly good interception rate of 90%, and it's been used since about 2012. So Hamas fired rockets in 2012, 2014, 2018, 2021, and in each of those incidents, the Iron Dome intercepted over 90%.
Who developed and constructed it?
So it was originally developed by an Israeli company, the Rafael Air Defense System. And over the past few years, it's also been co-produced by Raytheon in Arizona.
Why and how does the United States fund the Iron Dome?
Well, the U.S. funds Iron Dome as part of a defense aid to Israel. And since 2012, we've given approximately $3 billion for the Iron Dome system.
And has there been much debate regarding the U.S. support of it in Congress?
Yeah, so Congress is fully supportive of the system, and in part because it is very effective in addressing the threat of incoming rockets.
And if it's such a wonderful missile deterrent, why doesn't Ukraine have access to its use with its war with Russia?
So this is a good question. Ukraine has requested it. Israel has held back on supplying this to Ukraine in part for political considerations, its relationship with Russia, but also because it does not want Russia to get a hold of that technology in case Russia captures it in any military operations in Ukraine.
Since the U.S. plays a role in its development and construction, does the U.S. have access to this technology?
Yes, the U.S. does have access. It does co-produce this. Raytheon co-produces it, and the U.S. Army has also purchased a few batteries of this missile defense system.
And finally, Professor, what is this new iron beam system that's supposed to work in tandem with the Iron Dome?
The new iron beam is currently undergoing research and development. It should be operational within a year, and it is designed to intercept rockets at even shorter ranges than the Iron Dome. So, in fact, it would complement the Iron Dome.
Thank you very much for taking my questions today, Professor Dinshaw Mistry, a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio.
Thank you, Rick.
After nearly 20 months of waging war in Ukraine, Russia was suspended by the International Olympic Committee on Thursday. The IOC's executive board imposed the suspension on the Russian Olympic Committee for breaching the rules and principles by incorporating sports councils in 4 regions illegally annexed in eastern Ukraine.
Namely Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhzhia, constitutes a breach of the Olympic Charter because it violates the territorial integrity of the NOC of Ukraine as recognized by the IOC in accordance with the Olympic Charter.
International Olympic Committee spokesperson Mark Adams.
The suspension has the following consequences. The Russian Olympic Committee is no longer entitled to operate as a national Olympic committee, as defined in the Olympic Charter, and cannot receive any funding from the Olympic movement.
Adams said the IOC's suspension of the Russian Olympic Committee is immediate. And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage of Ukraine and news from around the world, 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, we thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA's Lori London.
This is the voice of America. Washington, D.C.
On the show today, violence and diplomacy both continue in the Middle East.
We are in touch with our Israeli counterparts. We're in touch with the United Nations to help secure the necessary supplies of food, water, and medicine to the citizens of Gaza, those Palestinians who have nothing to do with the barbaric terrorists who carried out this attack.
Plus, the latest from the House of Representatives.
Unable to pass any legislation sending aid to Israel or Ukraine until lawmakers hold a full floor vote next week.
And later, news from Afghanistan after another deadly earthquake and election results in Poland. Today is Monday, October 16th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. A close-up look at Israel's Iron Dome defense system in a few minutes, but we begin today with the latest on the fighting and the diplomacy in the Middle East. The United States has renewed calls to ensure that innocent civilians fleeing the Israel-Hamas war are protected and have their basic needs met. Separately, concerns about a wider regional conflict are leading an American senator to issue a strong warning against Iran and the Lebanon-based militia Hezbollah. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has that story.
The Israel Defense Forces have underscored their determination to destroy Hamas in its entirety, following the militant group's deadly incursion into Israel on October 7. They also renewed calls for Palestinian civilians to evacuate the northern part of Gaza before strikes by Israel intensify. The IDF's spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, was interviewed on ABC.
We are seeing that people are actually evacuating. Indeed, we would like to see the humanitarian organizations assisting in the evacuation of people for the welfare of people and not side with Hamas telling them not to evacuate.
With more than 1 million Palestinian civilians potentially trying to move out of harm's way, the United States is working with its partners to ensure the humanitarian needs of the displaced are being met, said White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on ABC's This Week.
We are in touch with our Israeli counterparts. We're in touch with the United Nations to help secure the necessary supplies of food, water, and medicine to the citizens of Gaza, those Palestinians who have nothing to do with the barbaric terrorists who carried out this attack.
The exchange of fire continued over the weekend at the Israeli border with Lebanon, where the Iran-backed militia Hezbollah operates. Republican Lindsey Graham, who plans to visit the region in the coming days with a bipartisan group of U.S. senators, issued a strong warning against Tehran and its allies, intending to play a more active role in the conflict.
If Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran, launches a massive attack on Israel, I will consider that a threat to the state of Israel, existential in nature. I will introduce a resolution in the United States Senate to allow military action by the United States in conjunction with Israel to knock Iran out of the oil business. Iran, if you escalate this war, we're coming for you.
Meanwhile, as part of a regional tour aimed at diffusing tensions, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met Sunday with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. They both agreed on the importance of ensuring assistance to the Palestinian civilians fleeing the war, according to spokesperson Matthew Miller. Blinken is expected to travel again to Israel on Monday for further consultations. Veronica Balderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
A little more on the diplomacy angle. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken continued his diplomatic push across 7 nations in the Middle East, trying to stop the conflict from spreading, and he reached out to his Chinese counterpart. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
1 week after the brutal attacks by Hamas militants on Israel, Israeli forces massed along the border with Gaza after warning residents of Gaza City to leave so that they can destroy Hamas operating capacity. The United Nations and other international organizations warned that water is running out in Gaza and that asking some 1 million people to evacuate from northern Gaza in the middle of a war zone is dangerous and in some cases impossible. Amid the tensions, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the United Arab Emirates as part of a 7-country tour to try to stop the violence from spreading. Blinken toured Abu Dhabi's Abrahamic Family House, an interfaith complex that opened in February, housing a mosque, a church, and a synagogue. Blinken signed a tile on the wall with the words, "Light in the Darkness." Earlier in the day, Blinken held talks with his Saudi counterpart in Riyadh. He again stressed that there can be no more business as usual with Hamas after the atrocities committed against Israeli civilians.
Hamas is not representative of the Palestinian people or their legitimate aspirations for the future. Hamas is a terrorist group. Its only agenda is to destroy the state of Israel and to murder Jews. And it's important that the entire world see it as such.
The Saudi foreign minister said it is important to condemn the targeting of civilians in any form at any time by anyone. Prince Faisal bin Farhan, Saudi foreign minister.
We need to work together to find a way out of this cycle of violence. This is something that we really, really need to focus on. Without a concerted effort to end this constant return to violence, it will always be the civilians that suffer first. It will always be civilians on both sides that end up paying the price.
Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, called on Israel Saturday to stop its attacks on Gaza, warning that the war might expand to other parts of the Middle East if Hezbollah joins the battle, in what would make Israel suffer what he called a huge earthquake. The State Department said Blinken also reached out to his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, on Saturday and had a 1-hour phone conversation, emphasizing that it is in everyone's interest to do everything possible to keep the conflict from spilling over into other countries. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
And here are some other stories we're following from around the world. Poland's incumbent Law and Justice Party was narrowly ahead in Sunday's general election, exit polls showed, but the liberal opposition appears to have secured a majority, raising the possibility of an end to 8 years of nationalist rule. If the outcome is confirmed by official results, the vote would mark a massive turnaround for Warsaw. The search continued on Sunday for the 167 people still missing after a boat capsized on the Congo River in the northwestern Democratic Republic of Congo on Friday. At least 30 people are known to have drowned. And Taylor Swift is setting records again. Her Eras Tour movie has earned over $95 million in its opening weekend, making it the largest grossing concert film of all time, and it's only been in the theater since Thursday.
Oh, look what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Look what you just made me do. Look what you just made me do. Look what you made me do. Look what you made me do.
Missiles continue to fall on southern Israel as Israeli troops gather at the border for an anticipated incursion into Gaza. VOA's Celia Mendoza is there.
I am Celia Mendoza reporting from Sderot, Israel, on the border with Gaza, where today I am witnessing the Iron Dome in action after missiles fired from Gaza to Israel were intercepted by the sophisticated system. Hamas has maintained the capability to launch these strikes even after the constant shelling by the Israel Defense Forces. The Israeli government has cut off access to Gaza of electricity, water, food, and gas, leaving the civilians in a dire situation, according to the United Nations. The UN is warning against the strategy implemented in Gaza by Israel. As I left Sderot, the sound of explosions continued and thousands of troops are gathering along the border with Gaza in an area that has been evacuated. I am Celia Mendoza from Sderot, Israel, for Voice of America.
In Celia's report, we heard about the Iron Dome defense system in Israel, but what is it and how does it work? VOA's Rick Pantaleo spoke with missile defense expert Professor Dinshaw Mistry from the University of Cincinnati.
So the Iron Dome is one layer of a multi-layer missile defense system. and it is the layer designed for the shortest range incoming rockets, a range of about 2 to 40 miles. And then there are other layers of missile defense, such as the David sling and the arrow, that defend against rockets coming in from greater ranges. So that's the short definition of the system.
And what does it do? I understand that it has intercepted 90% of projectiles fired toward Israel since it was attacked by surprise by Hamas.
That is right. It has a fairly good interception rate of 90%, and it's been used since about 2012. So Hamas fired rockets in 2012, 2014, 2018, 2021, and in each of those incidents, the Iron Dome intercepted over 90%.
Who developed and constructed it?
So it was originally developed by an Israeli company, the Rafael Air Defense System. And over the past few years, it's also been co-produced by Raytheon in Arizona.
Why and how does the United States fund the Iron Dome?
Well, the U.S. funds Iron Dome as part of the defense aid to Israel. And since 2012, we've given approximately $3 billion for the Iron Dome system.
And has there been much debate regarding the U.S. support of it in Congress?
Yeah, so Congress is fully supportive of the system, and in part because it is very effective in addressing the threat of incoming rockets.
And if it's such a wonderful missile deterrent, why doesn't Ukraine have access to its use with its war with Russia?
So this is a good question. Ukraine has requested it. Israel has held back on supplying this to Ukraine in part for political considerations, its relationship with Russia, but also because it does not want Russia to get a hold of that technology in case Russia captures it in any military operations in Ukraine.
Since the U.S. plays a role in its development and construction, does the U.S. have access to this technology?
Yes, the U.S. does have access. It does co-produce this. Raytheon co-produces it. And the U.S. Army has also purchased a few batteries of this missile defense system.
And finally, Professor, what is this new iron beam system that's supposed to work in tandem with the Iron Dome?
So the new Iron Beam is currently undergoing research and development. It should be operational within a year, and it is designed to intercept rockets at even shorter ranges than the Iron Dome. So, in fact, it would complement the Iron Dome.
Thank you very much for taking my questions today, Professor Dinshaw Mistry, a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio.
Thank you, Rick.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. Still to come on the program, a look at the dysfunction inside the U.S. House of Representatives and an answer in Saturday's referendum in Australia to include native peoples in the country's constitution. But before any of that, there's been another powerful earthquake in Afghanistan. This latest disaster follows a pair of strong earthquakes and aftershocks that recently killed thousands of people. VOA's Arash Arabasadi has more.
Afghans are once again bringing their injured to hospitals as the country suffers its third magnitude 6.3 earthquake in just over a week. The U.S. Geological Survey says the quake's epicenter was about 34 kilometers outside the provincial capital, Herat. Authorities report a handful of people dead and at least 150 injured, according to the head of the emergency relief team, who cautioned that those numbers may rise as rescuers reach more affected areas. Some in Herat had already been sleeping in tents following last week's earthquakes that killed thousands and leveled buildings. They say they don't feel safe returning home. Herat resident Barat Ali speaking with Reuters.
We have been staying on the road for the last 5 or 6 days since the first quake struck because our homes are not strong enough. So we came out living here for fear of more quakes.
The United Nations says aid deliveries have been underway as of midweek, but they fall far short of Afghanistan's needs. Head of Communications for the UN's World Food Program, Philippe Kropf.
This is a disaster on top of a disaster on top of a disaster on top of a disaster. Currently, we have 15 million people who do not know where their next meal will come from. And the World Food Program is only able to support 3 million people due to a massive funding shortfall. So we're really calling on the international community to support the Afghan people, stand in solidarity, and also support the World Food Program.
Despite budget shortfalls, the UN says it may consider cash distributions in the coming weeks. Afghanistan's healthcare system widely relies on foreign aid, which has been drying up since the Taliban took control more than 2 years ago. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives have nominated conservative Jim Jordan from Ohio on Friday in a chaotic third day of attempting to elect a Speaker of the House. As VOA's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson reports, Jordan needs substantially more support to win a full floor vote, expected for this Tuesday, to become the person who will be second in the presidential line of succession.
The U.S. House of Representatives at a standstill, unable to pass any legislation sending aid to Israel or Ukraine until lawmakers hold a full floor vote next week to decide if conservative Republican Jim Jordan will become Speaker.
I think I can unite the conference. I think I can go tell the country what we're doing and why it matters to them.
Jordan won the Republican conference vote 124-81 in a secret ballot. He now has several days to build support to get to the 217 votes he needs to be elected. George Washington University's Casey Burgat.
The problem is that what satisfies one doesn't satisfy the other. And in that instance, you end up making a lot of different promises to other people, which can upset some of the other folks in the party. And so this is why it's always been a very fine line to walk for a potential speaker, and why we've already seen one kicked out of his office already.
Jordan, a 9-term congressman known for his investigations into the Biden administration, earned the endorsement of Kevin McCarthy, who was removed from power as Speaker of the House in a historic vote last week.
And I think Jim Jordan could do an excellent job.
Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries is expected to win the support of all 212 Democrats when the decision goes to a full House floor vote.
House Republicans have just elected a Speaker nominee who in 16 years in this Congress hasn't passed a single bill, because his focus has not been on the American people. His focus has been on peddling lies and conspiracy theories and driving division amongst the American people.
Some Democrats have suggested a power-sharing agreement to reach the 217 needed for election. Republicans are also exploring giving temporary Speaker of the House, Patrick McHenry, more permanent powers to pass legislation for a period of several weeks. Casey Burgat.
With 218 votes, with a majority in the House, you can do almost anything, including change the rules, create new precedents. So if they did want to empower him, the Speaker pro tem, McHenry or otherwise, into basically a speaker in waiting kind of position, they could do that.
The House is expected to return to Washington for the full floor vote Monday. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
And finally today, following up on a story we first brought you last week. On Saturday, Australia decisively rejected a proposal to recognize Indigenous people in the Constitution. It's seen as a major setback to the country's efforts for reconciliation with its First Peoples. Reuters' Ilan Rubens has the story.
Australians had to vote yes or no in the referendum on the question of whether to alter the Constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people through the creation of an Indigenous advisory body, the Voice to Parliament. Australia's Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
At the outset, I want to say that while tonight's result is not one that I had hoped for, I absolutely respect the decision of the Australian people and the democratic process that has delivered it.
Australian media projected that at least 4 states would vote against altering the 122-year-old constitution. including New South Wales, Tasmania, Queensland and South Australia. A successful referendum requires at least 4 of the 6 states to vote in favour, along with national majority. Because of Australia's time zones, voting in Western Australia was still underway as it became clear the referendum was lost. Emotions ran high in the Yes campaign camp. Auntie Shirley Lomas is an Indigenous leader.
I imagine today most of the visceral voters would have voted no, and that's because of the ingrained and deep-seated fear, and they wouldn't use their intellect to vote yes.
Australia's Indigenous citizens, who make up 3.8% of the country's 26 million population, have inhabited the land for about 60,000 years, but are not mentioned in the Constitution. They are, by most socio-economic measures, the most disadvantaged people in the country. Many Indigenous people favoured the change, but some said it was a distraction from achieving practical and positive outcomes. The political opposition has criticised the measure, saying it is divisive, would be ineffective and would slow government decision-making.
That's Reuters' Alon Rubens reporting. And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
The relationship with China is arguably the most consequential and the most complex of any that we have, said U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during a conversation at Rice University in Houston, Texas. China, said Secretary Blinken, has the military, economic, and diplomatic means to pose a challenge to the current understanding of the rules of the road.
We don't shy away from the notion that we're in an intense competition. And as Americans, there's nothing wrong, and in fact, in many ways, everything right with competition, as long as it's fair and as long as we are properly resourced to succeed in that competition.
There are 2 foundations the Biden administration has put in place to deal with the challenges posed by China, Secretary Blinken said.
It starts at home, because our strength at home goes directly to our ability to have a strong standing around the world and to deal with competition from other states. The investments that we've been able to make over the past 2.5 years, truly historic in nature. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the Chips and Science Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which goes to 21st century climate technology and energy technology. This is a demonstration that America is determined to compete and America is determined to lead.
The second foundation is to work with other countries to build what Secretary Blinken calls convergence.
There's tremendous power in that convergence of approaches, because just take economic issues where we have differences with China. If it's only the United States that is opposing something that China's doing, well, that's significant, but we're 20% of world GDP. If we're aligned with European partners, with key partners in Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, suddenly we're 50 or 60% of world GDP. And that is a weight that no country, including China, can ignore.
There are also areas where the United States is directly contesting China's activities, and Secretary Blinken said, "We will do whatever we have to do." However, he stressed the United States and China do have overlapping interests where there is opportunity for cooperation, including climate change, global health, and non-proliferation. I don't think these things are in contradiction, said Secretary Blinken, but the common denominator is approaching each of them from a position of strength.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Coming up on the show today, U.S. President Joe Biden planning to visit Israel on Wednesday.
President Biden will underscore our crystal clear message to any actor, state or non-state, trying to take advantage of this crisis to attack Israel. Don't.
Plus, VOA is in Warsaw for Polish election results.
It is a very close race, and as a result, Poland is entering the time of some political turmoil.
And we stroll through the deserted ancient streets in the old city of Jerusalem, and we revisit the Turkish border with Armenia following Azerbaijan's capture of Nagorno-Karabakh. Today is Tuesday, October 17th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. We start today with a developing story from Israel. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrapped up a 7.5-hour meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the early pre-dawn hours of Tuesday. They agreed on a plan to get much-needed humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. We'll hear about that in a minute. And they made arrangements for President Biden to visit Israel on Wednesday.
He's coming here at a critical moment for Israel, for the region, and for the world. And he's coming here to do the following. First, the President will reaffirm the United States' solidarity with Israel and our ironclad commitment to its security. President Biden will again make clear, as he's done unequivocally since Hamas's slaughter of more than 1,400 people, including at least 30 Americans, that Israel has the right and indeed the duty to defend its people from Hamas and other terrorists and to prevent future attacks. The President will hear from Israel what it needs to defend its people as we continue to work with Congress to meet those needs. Second, President Biden will underscore our crystal clear message to any actor, state or non-state, trying to take advantage of this crisis to attack Israel. Don't. To that end, he's deployed 2 aircraft carrier groups and other military assets to the region. Third, the President will continue to coordinate closely with our Israeli partners to secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas, including men, women, small children, Holocaust survivors, and American citizens, as an indispensable humanitarian effort. Fourth, President Biden will receive a comprehensive brief on Israel's war aims and strategy. Fifth, the President will hear from Israel how it will conduct its operations in a way that minimizes civilian casualties and enables humanitarian assistance to flow to civilians in Gaza in a way that does not benefit Hamas.
The announcement of the plan to distribute humanitarian aid was short on specifics, but did contain a forceful warning.
Today, and at our request, the United States and Israel have agreed to develop a plan that will enable humanitarian aid from donor nations and multilateral organizations to reach civilians in Gaza, and them alone, including the possibility of creating areas to help keep civilians out of harm's way. It is critical that aid begin flowing into Gaza as soon as possible. We share Israel's concern that Hamas may seize or destroy aid entering Gaza or otherwise preventing it from reaching the people who need it. If Hamas in any way blocks humanitarian assistance from reaching civilians, including by seizing the aid itself, we'll be the first to condemn it, and we will work to prevent it from happening again. We welcome the government of Israel's commitment to work on this plan. The President very much looks forward to discussing it further when he's here on Wednesday. Thanks very much.
That's Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Israel on Tuesday. Be sure to follow voanews.com for the latest information as it develops. We'll go for a walk in the old city of Jerusalem in a few minutes, but now some more on the diplomatic response to the conflict in Israel. European Union heads of state have scheduled an emergency video conference scheduled for Tuesday afternoon in Brussels. They'll be discussing the worsening conflict between Israeli forces and Hamas militants in Gaza. As Henry Ridgewell reports, the mounting death toll has exposed divisions in the European response.
There are growing fears in Europe that the conflict between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza will be felt beyond the Middle East. The European Union has called an emergency heads of state conference to be held Tuesday. European Council President Charles Michel.
It has the potential to worsen tensions between communities and to feed extremism. Finally, there is a major risk of migration and movements of a large number of people to neighboring countries.
European nations gave Israel their full support in the days following the Hamas attacks. But critics say there has been mixed messaging from EU leaders as the Israeli assault on Gaza intensifies. Visiting the Kfar Aza kibbutz Friday in southern Israel, where Hamas killed dozens of civilians, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen offered unequivocal support.
Israel has the right to defend itself. In fact, it has the duty to defend its people.
Following that speech, the chair of the European Parliament's Security and Defence Subcommittee, Nathalie Loiseau, wrote that von der Leyen was forgetting an important message. Israel must respect international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said last week Israel's siege of Gaza is against international law. The political narrative is becoming more nuanced, says Middle East analyst Andreas Krieg.
I think we're already seeing some of the Western policymakers backtracking and trying to put things into context and saying, while we stand with Israel, we also have to make sure that the lives of Palestinian civilians have to be secured and protected.
That view is echoed in European public opinion, says analyst Andreas Bohm.
They do have solidarity for Israel, I think, due to the nature of the attack. But if you go on a long run, if we see these pictures of, say, thousands or 10,000s of people killed in Gaza, so that might change again.
Israel is unlikely to change course, says Krieg.
I think the Israelis also will be more resilient in sustaining criticism and sustaining also the leverage of Western policymakers, because they're saying this is our war, look at these atrocities, and we'll do whatever is necessary to eradicate Hamas.
Meanwhile, the European Union's Executive Commission has announced a tripling of humanitarian assistance to Gaza to $79 million. With Israel maintaining a complete siege of the territory, it isn't clear how or when the aid might reach those in need. Henry Ridgewell, VOA News, London.
And here are some other stories we're following from around the world. 2 Swedish nationals were shot dead and a third wounded in central Brussels on Monday night. A man who identified himself as a member of Islamic State claimed responsibility in a video posted online. The suspected assailant fled the scene after the shooting as a football match between Belgium and Sweden was abandoned at halftime. Russia's foreign minister will visit North Korea this week, the foreign ministry said on Monday. This comes just days after the United States claimed Pyongyang had delivered munitions and military equipment to Russia to use in the fighting in Ukraine. The White House said that more than 1,000 containers of equipment and ammunition had been sent to Russia from North Korea. And a U.S. federal judge in Washington imposed a partial gag order on former President Donald Trump, restricting what he can say about his impending trial on charges that he illegally tried to overturn the 2020 election. The former president is prohibited from speaking publicly about the prosecutors, witnesses, or courtroom staff. Jerusalem's Old City, one of the most visited places in the world, is empty. Since the beginning of the war between Israel and Hamas, tourists and pilgrims have fled, fearing an escalation of violence, especially as Israel prepares for a possible ground war in Gaza. As Jan Boychat reports from Jerusalem's Old City, shops are closed, churches are empty, and locals avoid leaving their homes.
Just a few days ago, these once bustling streets were teeming with people. But since the war between Hamas and Israel began, the Old City of Jerusalem resembles a ghost town. Tourists and pilgrims have fled, fearing the brutal violence of the Gaza Strip and areas surrounded, and the Lebanon border might reach this far. Minder Kalotti owns a shop in the Muslim quarter of the Old City.
As you see, it's like a strike. It's a few people going out, but there's no tourists, no people coming in, and it's very sad.
Most shops are closed, and the few that are open hardly have any customers. Some merchants say they are coming to work just to avoid staying at home and watching the distressing news about the war. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most visited sites in Jerusalem, very few people attended Sunday Mass. Clerics here say they have never seen the church as empty as it is now. At the Western Wall, only the most observant came to pray. In the Christian quarter, Yahya Atzieh says he has been here since before the 1948 creation of the State of Israel, selling souvenirs to tourists and pilgrims. He says that not even during the most violent times has he seen the old city like this.
Not like now. This is the first time I saw it very empty, because it's a big war in Gaza.
In the first 9 months of 2023, nearly 2.7 million tourists visit here. Now, shop owners wonder when the visitors will be back. Jan Boychat, VOA News, Jerusalem.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. Still to come on the show, does your investment portfolio include comic books? Well, perhaps it should. Plus, a visit to the Turkish border with Armenia. Now, though, we go to Poland, where voters have turned out in some of the greatest numbers seen in the country's elections to cast their ballots. PiS, or the Law and Justice Party, is ahead in the polls, but does not yet have a clear majority needed to form a government. Opposition parties promised to repair the nation's constitutional order and its relationship with allies, including the EU and Ukraine. However, it's uncertain if there will be a clear winner. VOA's Eastern Europe Bureau Chief Miroslava Gongadze is in Warsaw.
The governing coalition, right-wing Law and Justice Party, that has been in power for 8 years, got, according to the exit polls, most of the votes on Sunday. However, they have been in power for 8 years, and many people I talked to at the voting stations, and many people, just residents of Warsaw and other cities, said that they had enough of this coalition. So basically, what polls showed this election, that they do want change. An Ipsos exit poll published early this Monday gives PiS 36.6% of the vote, which would translate into 198 lawmakers in the 460-seat parliament. Opposition parties, led by the former European Council President Donald Tusk's Civic Coalition, are projected to win combined 248 seats. Again, it's a 50% of the voting have been counted. However, as we predicted, it is a very close race, and as a result, Poland is entering the time of some political turmoil.
The opposition leader, Donald Tusk, is already declaring the beginning of a new era for Poland. So what are the implications of this new era?
I would not talk about new era yet, because this will be a longer, possibly longer process than maybe Polish voters or even outside observers want. If President Duda will let Law and Justice Party to try to form the coalition and then their government, he has a right to do that because the Law and Justice Party won majority of the votes. However, the experts say it is almost almost impossible for them to be able to form that coalition. So that means that the parliament opposition coalition will get the second try at the forming the government, and then President Duda could also decline to ask Law and Justice to try to form the government, given the parliamentary mass. So this is like a very, very difficult process. If the second parliamentary attempt fails, then President Duda will select another candidate for PM. And if that will fail, he can call a fresh election. So if all these stages pan out, Poland could be without a government into November and December, or heading toward the fresh election.
That's VOA's Eastern Europe Bureau Chief Miroslava Gongadze in Warsaw. She was speaking with my colleague Kim Lewis. Comic books are anything but funny to some investors. That story's up next. Now, Azerbaijan's recapture of the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave from ethnic Armenians could mean that Turkey will soon reopen its border with Armenia after more than 30 years. Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul.
Turkey closed its border with Armenia in 1993 after ethnic Armenians seized the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh enclave from Turkey's close ally, Azerbaijan. After Azerbaijani forces last month recaptured the enclave, some analysts say there is an opportunity to end Turkey's embargo that has damaged Armenia's economy and forced it to rely on neighbouring Russia. Hussein Baja is the head of the Foreign Policy Institute, a research organisation in Ankara.
Turkey can play a very constructive role for the economic development of Armenia. The Armenians have to make a choice between poverty and prosperity. The more confrontation means more poverty. The more engagement means prosperity.
In a sign of improving relations, Ankara opened its border to allow Armenian aid after February's deadly earthquakes in Turkey. And Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan attended Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's inauguration after his May election victory. To reopen the Armenian border, Ankara is demanding Yerevan recognize the Turkish border and a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Some analysts say Yerevan is ready for a deal as it seeks to break away from Russia's influence, and having the war out of the way is a big step. Eric Hachopian is a political consultant in Armenia.
The economy is moving in the right direction. The Western pivot is moving in the right direction. Democratization is moving in the right direction. And the only thing that's interfering with that is the threat of war. So you take away the threat of war, all of this becomes easier. The economic acceleration continues.
But an opportunity for a peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, brokered by the European Union, this month fell victim, some observers say, to diplomatic infighting between EU leaders and Turkey. Soli Özel is an international relations professor at Kadir Has University.
Azeris said that Turkey ought to be in the talks. The Germans and the French said Turkey cannot be in the talks, and you really wonder which world they're living in. I would have expected that the Europeans, particularly the French, would work with Turkey and get Armenia out of the orbit of Russia.
Observers say Russian President Vladimir Putin was quick to seize the opportunity to bring Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev closer to his influence, inviting him to a regional summit in Kyrgyzstan, where Putin offered a broker a peace deal, an offer rejected by Yerevan. Russian expert Tatiana Mitrova is a visiting professor at the Paris School of International Relations.
Russia was always playing on these contradictions and mutual dissatisfaction, and it was a typical divide and rule policy starting from Tsarist Russia, not even Soviet Union. So it has very, very long historic roots. My impression is that these days Moscow would do everything to create instability everywhere.
Azerbaijan's recapture of the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave may lead to the reopening of Turkey's border with Armenia after 3 decades. But observers warn Moscow could yet undermine those efforts after the failure of the European Union to broker a peace deal between Baku and Yerevan. Dorian Jones of VOA News, Istanbul.
And finally today, would you pay $1 million for a comic book? Well, neither would I. Since 2006, comic book fans have gathered at the legendary New York City Comic Con to dress up and shop. And more recently, they've gathered to invest. Aaron Rainin has the story from New York.
More than 200,000 avid comic book enthusiasts, adorned in their beloved comic character costumes, descended upon New York City's Javits Center over the weekend to partake in the New York City Comic Con. Yuki Chrissy is a Comic Con attendee.
I love Comic Con because I like to see all the cool exclusives and cosplays, everything. It's just it's an experience.
As the spotlight shines brightly on costumes and the vast array of innovative new comics, older treasures like vintage comic books have also made their grand entrance, boasting price tags that climb into the millions. Vincent Zerzolo is president of Comic Connect.
When you go to Comic-Con, you're going to see all the flash and the glitz, all the cosplayers, the Hollywood stars. But at its core, at its heart, it's all about vintage comic books. You're going to see rows of books worth millions of dollars.
Zerzolo says certain books are worth more than diamonds.
This one right here is by Bob Kane from DC Comics from 1939. It's the first appearance of Batman ever in a comic book. This comic book in this condition is worth approximately $400,000. This is Marvel Comics #1. This copy is one of the best copies known to exist in the world, and this comic book is worth $3 million.
In 2022, Heritage, the nation's leading comic art auction house, reported sales exceeding $195 million, a 7% increase from the previous year.
Comic books fit into some people's investment portfolios. They're looking for alternative forms of investment outside of stocks and bonds and precious metals. They're looking for something they're also passionate about, and they're passionate about comic books.
Online retailers have taken notice of this market, with eBay establishing a significant presence at Comic-Con. Whether you're a buyer or a seller, the incredible crowd at this year's Comic-Con solidifies that the love for comic art is rock solid. And who knows, that comic book you buy today may be worth a jackpot in the future. Aaron Rainin, VOA News, New York City.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Gender equality is one of the United Nations' 17 Sustainable Development Goals, set forth in 2015 and intended to be reached by 2030. Yet with little more than 6 years to go, progress is slow. Today, women stand at the head of only 28 countries and represent 1 in 4 members of parliament. According to UN Women, at this pace, the world will reach gender parity in another 130 years. The gender gap in power and leadership remains entrenched. Gender-based violence, including technology-facilitated gender-based violence, is increasing, and discrimination remains commonplace, said United States Permanent Representative to the UN's Economic and Social Council, Lisa Carty.
Those who stand in the way of the advancement of women and girls also reduce the prosperity and security of all persons, especially vulnerable groups. They erode the full potential of the democratic way of life. They undermine the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, and they make way for the unyielding grip of authoritarianism.
On the other hand, those who stand with women and girls create a space for the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all persons, regardless of gender, said Ambassador Carty.
As we focus on the advancement of women and girls in our societies, our nations, and our world, we see a clear connection between the treatment of women and girls and the well-being of all people. The evidence is clear. When women and girls are denied the full enjoyment of their human rights, all of society is harmed.
With that in mind, on the 1-year anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death, President Biden reaffirmed our commitment to the courageous people of Iran, who are carrying on the historic woman life freedom movement she inspired, said Ambassador Carty.
We applaud the bravery and sacrifice of so many who have stood up in the face of oppression and violence to fight for not just gender equality, but also broader fundamental freedoms which Iran's government has denied to women.
Human rights apply to all individuals, all of the time, everywhere, said Ambassador Cardi. We therefore question why anyone would seek to deny half the global population the full enjoyment of their human rights. Societies function best when all persons are included and recognized as equals. Global challenges can only be solved when women and girls in all their diversity have a seat at the table.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.